like this?" And she did an imitation that more resembled Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster as she moaned, "Brains." "No, not like that at all. If it's easier to believe, just think of them as people that are infected with a deadly and very infectious disease. Only the infection in these people kills their sense of restraint, of morality, of family, of right and wrong. These people are completely and utterly incurable. Oh yeah, and the disease, it makes them impervious to pain. You can shoot them, you can stab them, you can burn them. You can cut them in half, you can run them down with your car, you can do just about anything you can think of and it won't stop them. They might get knocked down or slowed somewhat, but don't be fooled. There's only one way to bring them down." Tony asked, "Is this where you tell us that the only way to kill them is to put a bullet in their heads and then burn their bodies under a full moon?" "Well, the first part of that is right anyway. The only way to put them down permanently is destroy the brain. Severe, blunt trauma like a hammer to the head would work, but it may take more than one whack and you may not have that kind of time. The best thing is to get them from a distance with one of the guns that Neil grabbed." "Good thinking, Neil." Neil was standing in the kitchen now. He was drinking from a bottle of water, but really he was hiding behind the water the way some speakers hide behind a podium. He, like Jerry, wasn't accustomed to being in the spotlight. His bottle empty, he went to the kitchen and refilled it from the tap. Kim asked, "How does the infection spread?" Danny, sitting quietly and taking everything in, answered, "The bite, right? It's in the bite. If you get bitten, you get the infection and die and then turn into a zombie. Isn't that right, Jerry?" Jules nodded and added, "I think that's what happened to my brother Martin. Does that mean Martin is in heaven with Grandpa?" Rachel said, "God, I hope so, sweetie." Then, to Jerry, "So what can we do?" Jerry was shocked that everyone was accepting his explanation of things. There was no dissension whatsoever, despite the fact that none of them had really seen one of them up close. None of them except Neil and Rachel, that was, and their moment in the parking lot was over before it even really started. A case of very aggressive hit and run. "For now," Neil chimed in, "we treat this like we would any natural disaster. Think of it like an earthquake. We'll probably lose power and water sometime soon. We need to fill everything we can find with water so we have some when the water is completely gone from the tap. Look around and try to find flashlights, batteries, and candles. That includes from the stacks down in the garage. I think if we work together, we can all get through this." Rachel asked, "How long do you think this will last?" Tony, walking away from the others and peering out the opaque curtains hanging in front of the windows, said, "I don't know. How long does it take for the world to end?" Chapter 28. It may have seemed like the world was coming to an end, and maybe it was. For the time being, however, there was still quite a bit to be done. The rest of that first day and into the early evening, they all scoured the house, looking for anything and everything that might be useful. Danny and Jules found some clothes that fit both of them in a couple of the bedrooms. It was about then that Neil realized that he was still wearing his tie and work identification badge. Of course, his Arrow brand wrinkle-free white shirt was anything but white by then. It was soiled a dull brownish gray with sweat, soot from the fireplace, and dirt from moving the firewood. He looked at himself in the mirror and laughed. He took off his badge and set it next to Megan's keys on a small table in the hallway. He loosened his silk Jerry Garcia necktie and undid his shirt's top button. Megan, surprisingly playfully, said, "Now you decide to loosen up a little. Make up your mind. Are you a cool as a cucumber business executive who can handle any situation and still look professional and businesslike? Or are you that guy that only owns 5 ties, one for each day of the week, and hangs them still knotted over your closet door so that you wouldn't have to learn how to actually tie them? It's hard to get a read on you, mister, changing your appearance as you have." Neil looked over at her and realized she wasn't wearing her Fred Meyer uniform anymore. She'd found some blue jeans and a comfortable brown sweater that fit rather nicely. He started to say something, but was momentarily stunned to silence when she turned toward him, and he felt an overwhelming urge to splash into the warm, inviting waters of her eyes. They were nothing short of intoxicating. He wanted to ask her if she wore cosmetic lenses to allow her to have such exquisitely colored eyes, but it didn't really matter to him. He was perfectly happy with the illusion for the time being. And that's not to say that the rest of her face wasn't similarly gorgeous. Her skin was smooth and still enjoyed the lingering but fading bronze of the summer sun. Her hair, no longer pulled back in a tight ponytail, was either a light brown or a faint red with strands of golden blonde intermingled here and there, an obvious attempt to make them appear the natural result of exposure to the sun. Like a luxurious red carpet, her smile was full and inviting. He hadn't seen all or really any of this at the Fred Meyer, and probably never would have under more normal circumstances. He was seeing it now, though, and it was becoming increasingly more difficult to concentrate on anything else. To further confound his senses, she was surrounded and accompanied by a ravishingly sweet but unaggressive aroma that made him think of warm summer days. She was, Neil realized, a very attractive woman. Neil guessed her to be about 2 or 3 years younger than him, which meant that she was 10 years younger than him at least. He was horrible at those things. He invariably embarrassed himself when drawn into those guessing contests with new co-workers. Age, weight, sexual orientation, astrological sign, political affiliation, or religion did not reveal themselves accurately to him on the biological or metaphysical barometers in his brain. Maybe he didn't get that part of the brain that permitted such activities. Regardless, she was a very attractive young woman who was smiling at him in the hallway. And she wasn't just smiling. She was smiling at him. At least, that was what the faulty barometer was telling him. Like many guys, when he was confronted with such a woman in tight confines, he became tongue-tied and uncoordinated in thought and action. Subconsciously, he was probably surprised that he was still standing. If she got too close to him, he was afraid that the vertigo that he was beginning to feel in that sense of anticipation would topple him over. Starting on more than one occasion to speak, he second-guessed himself and instead stood there silent, waiting for her to initiate the conversation between the two of them. The funny thing about all of his feelings was that he could not deny that he craved them. Watching Laney bounce into the building every morning for more than a year, he had experienced just an inkling of what he was feeling. He had all but forgotten about the butterflies that could dance and twitter in his belly. There was noise all around them in the house as everyone settled into their accommodations for the night, but in the back hallway, away from everyone else, there was a quiet and somewhat awkward moment between the two of them. It ended when Neil turned around and went back through the door leading into the garage. Megan caught him by the arm and said, "Hey, thanks for everything you did for us today." Neil shook his head and said, "I don't think I did anything other than just run to save my own ass." "Maybe," Megan admitted. "But you let all of us tag along, and so far, saving your ass has saved all of ours too. So thanks. Besides, if you were only interested in saving your own ass, then you wouldn't have come back for us when my car stalled. You'd have just driven on down the road and left us to fend for ourselves." Shaking his head and trying to confess as much to himself as to her, he pleaded, "You've got to understand, Megan. I don't have all the answers. Hell, I don't even know all the questions. I'm just a guy who's been in a rut of a job for too long and not sure how I wound up there, and maybe I'm even a little afraid to take the next step." And then this all happened. Smiling, she said, "You act like any of us are that different from you. I'll let you in on a little secret. How you described yourself is pretty much how it stands for all of us. You don't have to have all the answers. You just gotta be willing to try, that's all.
God, I hope it's enough.
So do I, honey. So do I.
The fact that she called him honey was not lost on him. Hearing himself called that warmed him from the inside out and brought a warm, pink glow to his cheeks. Maybe you're right, but I can't do this alone.
And nobody expects that of you. We gotta look out for one another. Gotta be able to count on one another.
She closed the distance between the two of them and wrapped her arms around him. She laid her head, which came up to just below his chin, against his chest. He was afraid that she could now feel and hear his racing heartbeat and think that he might have some congenital heart defect. His fear immediately gave way to the warm satisfaction that he felt with her pressed against him. With tears in her eyes, she asked very quietly,
"Just tell me everything's gonna be all right. That the storm will pass and we'll be okay."
He tilted his head and let his cheek rest on top of her hair and whispered, "Everything will work out. It always does. If nothing else, you can count on that."
"Promise?"
"Cross my heart."
"And hope to die?"
"Not at the moment." He didn't see the satisfied look creep onto her face as she nuzzled in closer on his chest. They held one another tight for a handful of heartbeats, and when they released each other, she said,
"You might think about a shower, Stinky."
"What?" And he sniffed himself curiously, wrinkling his nose uncomfortably. She walked away laughing and feeling, all things considered, pretty good. Chapter 29. The next morning, Neil awoke reluctantly. He looked around through his sleep-filled eyes, trying to remember where he was, when the memories of yesterday flooded back to him. He leapt up from the recliner in which he had been sleeping upright. He spun around, trying to see anything that he recognized. The darkness seemed so consuming, swallowing him up like the nightmare that had plagued his brief sleep. Then he realized that the nightmare he'd been having was just his memory replaying itself from the previous day's hellish events. His nightmare was actually his bitter reality. From the couch along the wall came a deep breath as someone turned over in sleep. He peered through the dark like a sailor into the fog hovering over a reef-filled cove. In the very scant light, his eyes adjusted to reveal the outline of a person sleeping. Neil breathed in and immediately knew that it was Megan. They had spent the better part of the night and much of the early morning talking and looking occasionally out the front window. He told her about his divorce, and she told him about her lingering engagement and less than committed fiancé. Other than the fact that the world they had known was unalterably changed and possibly balancing precariously on its last foot, it wasn't a bad night. Though their talk had become quite intimate, they both held any physical intimacy at arm's length. Neil's reservations and Megan's lingering commitment to a fiancé that was more than likely dead or worse helped to funnel those urges to the backs of their minds. He could finally make out the outlines of Megan's face in the very scant light. He stifled an urge to cross the room and kiss her on the cheek. Just seeing her was enough. Maybe it wasn't all bad after all. Neil stretched and yawned. He had to pull the Seminole College sweatshirt down over his belly. He'd found the sweatshirt and jeans he was wearing in a back bedroom, and though the clothes were a touch big on his frame, he was thankful the previous night to peel away the grimy clothes that he'd been wearing since the beginning of the tumult. He wandered out to the dining room and joined Tony and Jerry at the glass-top rectangular dining table. Jerry poured a cup of coffee from a white carafe sitting in the middle of the table on a cork pad and pushed the porcelain Mall of America mug toward him. The younger man, no longer in his hospital scrubs, said, "Enjoy it. It'll be the last pot cooked with the help of Mr. Coffee." Sipping the strong, hot brew, Neil asked with his eyes what he meant, to which Jerry responded, "Power just cut out, and I don't think Chugach Electric is going to be dealing with the outage anytime soon." Standing and heading over to the window, Neil asked, "Are we still alone out front, or have they found us yet?" Tony, who obviously hadn't been awake much longer than Neil, and a bit surprised by the casual nature of the conversation, asked the both of them, "What do you mean, yet?" Jerry answered them both. "It's just a matter of time. Before the streetlights went out, I'd been watching a group of maybe 5 of them down the road a bit. They seemed to be just standing there, waiting." Tony's eyes widened. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know for sure. What I do know is that they're definitely making their way toward us. When the lights went out, they were milling around about a block away. It's really just a matter of time." Neil asked, "Where are they now?" "In the middle of the road. I think they can smell us but can't quite place which house we're in. It's been a very gradual process. I felt like I was back in junior high biology class watching one of those time-enhanced videos of a bird hatching from an egg or a plant emerging from a seed. I didn't see them move. I only saw that they were closer." Tony was appalled. "They can smell us?" "Yeah. I think it has to be that. Or maybe it's the noise we make. It could be something else entirely different, or a combination of all those things." Neil finished Jerry's thought. "But if we think of them as predatory animals, then at least we've got a starting place with how to beat them." Leaning away from the table, as if he was trying to avoid the coming answer to his question, Tony asked, "You planning on taking those things on? I saw what they were doing to those folks on the highway. I ain't never heard screams like that before. It's exactly because of those screams that I want to know how to outwit those things. That's all we got on them. We can't fight them. There are just too many of them. We gotta beat them on other terms, terms of our making and not theirs." Jerry sipped his coffee, then offered, "While they stood there, they weren't necessarily standing still. They swayed back and forth like they were on a loaded spring waiting to be released. While they shuffled in their little circle, their legs moved like yours or mine, with maybe a little more stiffness to them. Maybe they're being affected by rigor mortis. Their arms and heads seemed to twitch every now and again, and they didn't seem to be able to control it. Even with those spastic tics, their eyes didn't miss anything. They looked into every shadow. I think they're stalking us." Tony said coyly, "Don't you know there are laws against that sort of thing? I mean, what's a guy got to do to get some peace?" "I'd tell you to call a cop, but..." Chapter 30. During the night, Emma crawled into the back seat to sleep. She didn't really want to sleep any closer to Officer Ivanov than absolutely necessary. She cried even through her sleep for most of the night. She had never felt such overwhelming sadness and helplessness in her life. The feelings chased her into her dreams and plagued her with the sense of falling and running impossibly slowly from a lurking menace. Like a faded memory coming back, the day's light gradually introduced itself. She opened her eyes sluggishly in the growing light. It was very chilly, so she pulled the throw blanket tighter around her. The 2 men were still sleeping, their breathing heavy and loud in the confines of the car. Despite the breathing, sleeping men near her, she felt completely alone. She started to cry again, a warm, silent cry that hurt her chest. She stifled the sobs fairly well so as not to disturb the 2 men. She heard a nearby wind chime begin to sing its stilted tune, reminding her of the wind chimes on her neighbor's porch. The old lady seemed to have a dozen or more sets hanging all around. Wooden chimes, metal chimes, some glass, some cut in the shapes of fish. The sound could sometimes interrupt an afternoon nap in the front room, but it was never an unwanted interruption. The sound itself was as soothing as a dream. There was something wrong, though. These chimes just seemed too random. Then she looked at the windsock perched atop the storage shed in the adjoining yard. It was hanging loosely, waiting for a wind to breathe into it life. There was no wind. She started to shake involuntarily. Timidly, She turned her head to look out the rear window. Her heart sank. One of those things was in the yard behind them. It was on the small wooden deck and doing very small circles, as if it was looking for something. Emma barely registered that the thing had once been a woman, and was still wearing a bathrobe tied at the waist. It appeared that her right hand was missing, and its place was a mess of ruined and raw flesh. At the moment, it wasn't looking in their direction.
"Oh, no,"
Emma breathed. Dr. Caldwell, his eyes just barely cracked open, asked, "What's wrong?" But then he sat up, realizing what exactly could be wrong. He followed her eyes and saw it moving around in the still very limited light of the still waking morning. He leaned forward and nudged the policeman sitting in front of him. Nothing. He shook him harder. The only response he received was flatulation and a grunt that originated from somewhere deep in sleep. The doctor was trying not to make any noise and draw that thing's attention. He leaned forward even farther and whispered, "Officer, officer," and continued to shake him as well. Officer Ivanov woke with a start and in a very loud, irritated voice demanded, "What in the hell do you want?" The police officer immediately remembered where he was and lowered quietly into his seat, but it was too late. The former woman loitering in the yard next to them emitted something that might have been the offspring from the copulation between an excited war cry and a voracious nighttime howl, a sound that cut each of them to the marrow. It was running at full tilt across the yard in an instant. Officer Ivanov turned the key, and to all of their relief, the car started without so much as a cough from the engine.
"I love this car,"
Emma said. Dr. Caldwell said as he loaded the big revolver, "I'll get you one when we get out of here. Deal?"
"Deal."
The police officer shifted the car into gear and made a wide turn in the still dew-wet yard, losing control just slightly but regaining with ample dexterity and confidence. Emma had to admit that he was a good driver. Still, she held tight to the back of the seat in front of her. Her heart was racing and her breathing was doing everything it could to keep pace. She held tightly to the handle on the ceiling just above the window as the car seemed to be overcorrected, and then she realized that it wasn't merely that. The cop was using the car's steering wheel like a gun sight, lining up the front of the car with the woman. Not to be outdone, she shifted her direction just slightly to put her on a collision course with the vehicle. Malachi Ivanov pressed the accelerator to the floor, and the Subaru's engine grumbled deeply. Emma was screaming for them to stop or veer away, anything, really, to avoid the impact. She swore that she could see the police officer grinning from ear to ear as the thing's legs crumpled against the car's grill. The ghoul toppled up onto the hood of the car and, shattering the front windshield, sailed up and over the roof. With its robe flapping wildly like an expanse of untethered terry-cloth sails, the former woman spun and thudded across the moist lawn. By the time she came to a halt, the car had turned back out onto the pavement and sped away. None of them in the car could see the beast come to rest, twisted and broken. And yet, even with a shattered pelvis and broken spine, she was so desperate to continue her pursuit that she clawed at the soft soil and grass with her one still functioning hand and tried to pull herself along after them. The car screeched onto the street and fishtailed slightly on the dew-damp pavement. Malachi's smile immediately faded when he beheld the crowd of ghouls that was coming at them from down the street. There were hundreds of those angry, hungry, tortured faces approaching them from a mere handful of blocks. He never, for even an instant, slowed the car. Emma screamed from the back seat,
"Are you fucking crazy? You're going to kill us all!"
Malachi ignored her. He looked to both sides, looking for an option. They passed a court, and then a circle with no road leading out presenting itself. Emma was still shrieking like a wild woman when he jarred the car hard to the right. A sign warned him that there was no outlet, but he saw what he needed. Dr. Caldwell, never really losing his cool, asked, Mal, This seems to be a dead end, but we're not slowing. Mal?" To Malachi, the doctor sounded suspiciously like that computer on that movie about outer space. He thought its name was Hal, but he could be wrong. There was a space between houses where there wasn't a fence. He was hoping to cut across yards and get to the road on the other side. He knew that it was risky, but he was fairly confident that most of the yards in the area into which they were heading were not yet fenced, as it was all new construction. Malachi felt the vehicle easily climb over the substantial curb. They jostled about for a brief moment afterward. Emma pulled her seatbelt on, as did the doctor. She closed her eyes and held her breath. Despite the calm facade, Dr. Caldwell was finding it difficult to keep his posterior in position on the car seat. He was pressing the imaginary brake pedal with all his might to no avail. They weren't stopping. They weren't even slowing. Maybe Malachi didn't see it. Maybe he thought that he could jump his car Hollywood action star style across it. The doctor wasn't entirely sure of the police officer's thoughts. Regardless, the silver Subaru Forester plunged from the grassy yard into the murky water of the drainage ditch that ran along the borders of this line of houses. The spunky little sport utility vehicle tried to climb its way out of the ditch, but found itself marooned between the steep incline of the opposite bank and the soft mud of the bottom of the trench. Its wheels continued to turn enthusiastically in the muck, even after it was glaringly apparent that it was going nowhere. Dr. Caldwell was the first to react. He unlatched his seatbelt and looked over his shoulder. They had just seconds. "Come on, guys, let's go. We haven't any time. Grab what you can and let's get going." Neither of his companions made a move for a second longer. "Listen, goddammit, I'm not going to get my ass chewed because you guys couldn't get yours moving. Now get going. They're almost on top of us." With that, both the police officer and the medical transcriptionist were jolted back to reality again. Malachi hefted himself up and forced the shattered windshield out of its frame and onto the hood of the car. Emma followed, and the doctor got out last, brandishing the heavy revolver they had found. He turned toward the crowd just a scant few yards away from them. He raised the pistol, pointed it toward their pursuers, but then thought better about wasting a precious bullet on something that would neither slow nor discourage the chase. The trio of hospital survivors ran hard and fast, not looking back for even an instant. The ditch proved a surprisingly effective obstacle to the ghouls, who had to end their pursuit and instead milled about around the wrecked car. Thankfully, this circumstance provided the three people a brief reprieve as they made their escape. Malachi, though, knew that they were in trouble. They were on foot again, and he need only remember the three people being pursued by that horde the day before. There, too, it had been one woman and two men. He wondered if the woman in that group had been as annoying and obviously weak as Emma. Her nagging and incessant screaming was starting to drive him over the edge. Maybe she was related to his wife. They certainly acted an awful lot alike at times. Emma didn't seem to be native, but perhaps the relation was distant and Emma only got the most annoying bits of that family's personality. Breathless and exhausted, Dr. Caldwell knew that they had to find somewhere safe and relatively secure to stop and rest. There were houses all around them, but he had his doubts as to how secure any house would be. Of course, if they were all too tired to continue to run and they were caught out in the open by those things, then a house wouldn't be that bad of an option. How long could they keep running? How long until help would arrive? How long could they stay alive? Chapter 31. Why don't we just shoot them? It's not like we don't have the guns and the ammo to do it. There are only 6 of them out there anyway. We could drop those few and maybe send a message to the rest of them. Tony was becoming more and more agitated as he spoke. It was late afternoon, and the group hiding in the house had been inside all day. The 2 kids, Jules and Danny, had entertained themselves with board games in a back bedroom while the adults took turns peering out the windows at the group that was forming in the street.
No, Megan answered Tony. Now there are 7 of them.
7? Where did the other one come from? He asked incredulously. He had been watching out the window not long ago, and there had only been 6 of the fiends. They seemed to be multiplying. Kim, sitting on the floor and drinking a beer, said soothingly,
"Oh, come on, honey. Have a seat with Mama. I'll make it all better."
She patted her lap with both her hands and leaned back. Almost as if on cue, the big man hunched his shoulders forward, laid down on the floor, and put his head in his friend's lap. She commenced to stroking his very short hair and humming a tune that they all recognized. Jerry, who had become the appointed specialist, added where Megan left off.
"No, I think that if we start shooting, more of them will come and they'll keep coming. Our best bet is to let them pass us by, if they will, and then figure out what to do next. We've got a few days' worth of supplies here. Maybe if we wait it out, someone will come looking for us."
Rachel chimed in.
"I thought there was a bunch of someones already looking for us."
And she gestured toward the outside. Jerry nodded and conceded.
"Someone who can help us and doesn't want to eat us, I mean."
Kim stopped humming and asked,
"How did all of this start, anyway?"
Neil shook his head and walked to the window. He didn't know. The kids and Jerry were at the hospital where all of it started. Danny and Jules kept talking about Jules's brother Martin getting bit on the hand and getting sick, but that was no real help. In the end, Neil suspected that it didn't really matter where or how it began. The cold, hard truth was that they were smack in the middle of a horror movie as it played itself out in reality. Other than that, the only other truths worth considering were those that would keep them all alive.
"I think we should start thinking about an escape plan," Neil said to the group.
Megan looked up at him from her spot on the couch.
"Escape? But you said yourself that we should wait for—"
"No, I mean escape in case something happens and those things find us and maybe even get in here." Jerry asked,
"What did you have in mind?"
Ever so quietly, so as not to draw attention to themselves, they loaded some bare necessities into the back of the minivan. Between the 2 front seats, Neil placed a shotgun, 2 handguns, and a pile of boxes of shells for each. He also put the key in the ignition, just in case they had to leave in a hurry. The rest of the day was spent trying to occupy themselves as best as they could. But really, what does one do when facing the end of the world? With limited resources and virtually no way to get anywhere, what do you do? Tony sat at the dining room table and wrote a series of letters to important people in his life. He penned one to his best friend, Angie, to whom he first came out. He wrote another to Phil, a past lover who was never really absent from his thoughts. And of course he wrote a letter to his mother. He took his time, carefully choosing what could possibly be the last words by which he would be remembered, sometimes agonizing over a sentence or a phrase until he wadded up the paper and started anew. With so few words and such a lack of space, he wanted each and every syllable to echo with his voice. These would be his testament, and he treated them as such. He spent the better part of the day writing those 3 letters, and when he was done, he laid his head down on the glass table and went to sleep. Rachel sat quietly on a chair in the corner of the living room and continued to drink from the bottle of vodka she found in the cabinet. After more carefully examining the bottle, she realized that it was actually a bottle of swódka, distilled potato vodka. It tasted more like lighter fluid to her than potable alcohol, but it did result in a very welcome numbing buzz as she drank it. She decided that the buzz was more important than having mutinous taste buds threatening to revolt. She was still experiencing a little shock from all that had happened, but she found herself curiously resenting the zombies for deciding to end the world on the same day that she was to get her annual review and the promise of a raise. She was due, damn it. She had worked so hard this year, and she was due. Everybody in that goddamned office was making more than her, and she was poised to do something about it. She took another sip from the bottle and quickly swallowed the potent liquid. Even with her buzz, the taste was still obnoxious. It was the kind of taste that caused her jaw to tighten. It had been some time since she had spoken or even stood, and she was in no hurry to determine how badly both of those could be given her rising inebriation. So far, she hadn't felt the need to relieve herself, so she was perfectly comfortable with not testing her abilities in either category. Absently, she checked her phone, still attached to her hip, for messages and tried to dial out again. It might as well be a paperweight for all the good that it was doing her. She thought about throwing it across the room in frustration, but she looked up to see Kim standing in front of her, and she kept her anger in check. Kim held out an empty glass and waited. Rachel smiled and poured a generous portion of the fiery, clear liquid, held up the bottle in a friendly, toasting fashion, and then took another drink. Kim smiled at the drunken woman with the messy, blonde, tangled curls, raised the small glass tumbler, and drank a sip herself. For a moment, Kim was concerned that Rachel had inadvertently grabbed a bottle of paint thinner or gasoline to drink. She'd never had straight vodka before, and now she knew why. Its transparency suggested to the casual observer that it might actually be smooth and as innocuous as water. That couldn't be further from the truth. Still, she held onto the glass and walked herself to the bathroom in the master bedroom. There was a large tub with plenty of towels back there, and she planned on pampering herself one last time. Luckily for her, the water and gas utilities had not yet stopped working, though it would just be a short while before the battery-powered backup generators would fail at those locations as well. While she filled the tub with hot water, she went in search of a good book. The reality of the situation was that she would have been satisfied with even a bad book, but none was forthcoming. Instead, she found a stack of magazines with titles like People, Us, and Soap Opera Digest. These would simply have to do for the time being. She piled her clothes in a neat pile next to the tub and climbed into the hot water, which came up to her neck. The heat from the water mixed with the heat from the alcohol in her belly helped to welcome a very real sense of contentment that almost, but not quite, chased away the day's worries and fears. With her head resting comfortably against an inflatable bath pillow, she tried to embrace the deep breathing exercises she learned some time ago in a martial arts class she had taken with her friend Desi. Across the hall from the master bedroom and Kim's moment of peace, there was anything but peace being waged as Jules, Danny, and Jerry were engaged in a very taut game of Risk. Jerry was holding Australasia pretty firmly and slowly expanding by way of southern Asia into Africa. In the meantime, Jules and Danny were fighting it out over Europe and North America and not paying much attention to Jerry's quiet aggression. There were plastic armies stacked all across the globe, poised to attack and defend. Jerry threw the dice and launched another successful and devastating attack against the scant red armies of Danny's imperial forces holding a patch of land in southern Asia. Jerry moved the lion's share of his armies into the now vacant land and continued his turn elsewhere. Jules was merely playing because Danny was. She didn't have any interest in this game, but it was the only one that she recognized of the several on the top shelf in the closet. It seemed a good idea just to be doing something. She watched as Jerry continued to play out his bid for world domination. She looked away from the game board, not at all concerned that she might miss one of Jerry's moves that impacted her own tenuous hold on southern Europe. Deciding that not having a barking dog in the backyard to draw attention to their sanctuary was in their best interest, the dog was brought inside to be with all the visitors in his house. Now he was curled contentedly next to Jules, who was even then stroking his ears and neck. He was a mutt, for sure, but had the size, fur, and friendly, if a little hyperactive disposition of a border collie. His confusion had given way to contentment as he enjoyed the attention of this new little girl. While all of this was unfolding, Neil and Megan, having found a stash of miniature Hershey chocolates hidden behind a stack of plastic bowls and tubs with lids, sat themselves on the stairs and indulged their sweet tooths. They didn't say much to one another, but took turns feeding chocolate candies into each other's mouths. Neil wondered to himself if they would ever get out of this situation alive. He munched on a crackle bar, enjoying the crunch of chocolate-covered Rice Krispies, and looked around. The house was as much a prison as it was a sanctuary. It wouldn't take long, he realized, for the walls around them to begin to threaten the fleeting peace they had found. And then what? Would they put to the test Sartre's supposition that hell is other people? Or would they, given the gravity of their situation, be able to see through any petty differences and come together to survive? Of course, only time would tell. He would just have to wait and see, just like the rest of them. Chapter 32. "We can see them now, sir. They're heading our way." The voice on the radiophone reported the update without any sense of fear or doubt. He might as well have been reading the nutrition label from a box of breakfast cereal. "Okay, son. We'll get some gunships airborne and headed your way ASAP." "Thank you, sir. We'll hold them here for as long as you need." All eyes in the command center were fixated on the colonel as he set the radio receiver down. They all realized that it could very well be any or all of them on the other end of the radio. Could each of them be as cool as the disembodied voice circling the communications room? The colonel stood facing the wall for a moment or two longer without turning to face everyone around him. He was having a difficult time focusing on the task at hand. It wasn't a simple matter of a military operation. He was faced with a confusing and seemingly spontaneous uprising with very few options to end it. Both military bases on the north side of Anchorage were in ruins and going through final death throes. Most of the heavy equipment that should have been at his disposal was either still serving with troops in the Middle East or was sitting uselessly in garages and motorcades on Fort Richardson. More pressing on his mind, though, was the fact that his wife was on the wrong side of the military cordon that was currently straddling the Glen Highway as the only force standing between the chaos that Anchorage had become and the rest of the state. He could order a helicopter and a rescue team to their house to retrieve her, but if he couldn't do that for all of his officers and soldiers in his command, then he couldn't do it for himself either. His wife, a stalwart supporter of fairness and consistency, would be the first to point that out to him. He could picture her saying it as he stood there. He could also hear her reminding him that the quicker he got the job done, the quicker he could move on to worrying about something else. He was an enduring worrier, and life just had a way of producing things about which he should and could worry. He finally looked over at another officer and asked, "How much longer until the bridge is ready?" As a last resort, the colonel had ordered the destruction of the bridge spanning the Knik Arm waterway, a narrow but effective natural waterway that separated Anchorage from the fertile Matanuska Valley and its roads that connected with the northern two-thirds of the state. If the disturbance was to cross the Knik on the existing bridge, it could spread in any direction and the colonel would be powerless to stop it. As it was, the Glen Highway was cut between the Chugach Mountains and served as a funnel to the Knik Arm crossing. He hoped that he could disperse the crowds when they saw the soldiers at the blockade, and then set to sorting out the madness that started all of it. So far, responses to the tumult had been piecemeal and very ineffective. Deployed across the Glen was an ad hoc battle group of more than 100 soldiers and the few Stryker armored vehicles available to him, a very intimidating if a little bit of a ragtag body of men and machines. Having the helicopter gunships hovering overhead should help to convince the leaders of the uprising to withdraw and start seeking different options to settle their grievances, whatever those might be. He heard the whirling chops of the helicopters as they flew out toward the roadblock. Almost immediately afterward, he could hear the distant pop and crack of small arms coming from his men on the line. The firing rose to a crescendo almost immediately and maintained the furious pace. He took a deep breath and said, "I need to get up there and see things for myself. Get me a chopper." Chapter 33. On the ground at the roadblock, the major in command peered through his binoculars at the approaching horde. But they weren't just approaching, they were running hard and fast right at them. He could see that many of them were wounded, or at least had blood on them. More importantly, he could see that this wasn't a small group of ethnic dissidents trying to dismantle the United States, or even Alaska, by disrupting communications, shutting down utilities, and spreading fear amongst the population. The group, at least in his eyes, was a perfect cross-section of ethnic groups that represented the population of Anchorage and Alaska as a whole. Everyone appeared to be represented. Ringing in his ear were the rumors about what had happened. Mass murders, mutilations, cannibalism. He'd always said that in every rumor there was a kernel of truth. But what if these rumors was true? Was any one more appealing than the others? What horrible truth was propelling these people? There were still some abandoned vehicles here and there along the road. He was amazed to see the cars disappear under the surge of humanity, as if some huge valve had just been opened and the screaming masses poured forth to swallow everything in its path. At first, simply piling onto and over the cars and trucks, soon the tsunami of people was carrying the automobiles along with it, like a stick riding the current in a storm drain during a spring rainfall. The wave stretched as far back as he could see. There were thousands of people coming right at him and his men, more than he could believe, and certainly more than he had been told to expect. Christ almighty! He shouted orders to the soldiers around him. Steady, men! Hold your fire until the order is given. Maybe we can turn these folks away without having to get heavy with them. His soldiers, posting themselves behind the hastily prepared defenses of concrete traffic barricades positioned side by side across the highway, readied their firearms for action and waited. He looked at them and could feel his heart begin to wane. Even if he and his men could hold these people at bay, he wasn't convinced they had enough bullets to be able to shoot all of them. He looked over his shoulder at the open road behind him. He could just climb in the Humvee on which he was standing and drive away. He could stay in front of this mob and never look back. He was sweating now. He could feel it running down his back between his shoulder blades and taste it on his upper lip. He had nearly convinced himself to do it, to just drive away as fast as he could, when he heard it. Preceding the masses was the sound of a freight train. The noise, corralled as it was by the mountains, grew in intensity with each passing collective breath of the awaiting soldiers until they could all feel it. Trying to be heard above the din, the major used a bullhorn to talk. Adhering to his training, he calmly said to the mob, "Please disperse." And then, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the United States Army. We require that you disperse and return to your homes at once." Taking a deep breath, the major almost pleaded, "Please turn around and return to Anchorage, or I will be forced to order my men to open fire." Hearing the loud voice and seeing the soldiers, the crowd only became more agitated and grew louder, their hungry groans becoming ravenous growls. They were a scant few hundred yards away when the major ordered his men to fire a warning volley above the multitude's heads. Several other soldiers fired tear gas into the bedraggled ranks as well, none of which had the slightest impact on the throng's progress. As if it knew its potential to turn a bad dream into a nightmare just by its presence, the smoke from the gas canisters clung to the ground and reluctantly rose up in dissipating, swirling wisps, fading like second guesses. The major licked his lips and got a full dose of salty fear. He then ordered, "Okay, boys, let 'em have it." There wasn't a moment's hesitation. Every gun in the firing line began to chatter and spit, the sound akin to a chainsaw cutting into a log. Instead, it was actually cutting into the lines of people coming at them. To the Major's amazement, the first mixed and disorderly rank was hurled back, but the majority of those hit were back on their feet almost at once to rejoin the others as they continued forward despite the storm of lead lashing into them. Through his binoculars, the Major could see with magnified clarity that the bullets his men were shooting were finding their marks. There was a steady, red, misty cloud that hung about the perpetually changing front ranks as bullets punched holes in chests, arms, and legs. There was something very wrong. His men were expending huge amounts of ammunition, and a mere handful of bodies were lying lifeless on the road. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't stop the rush. At about that moment, thankfully, a pair of Black Hawk gunships roared over their heads. A third helicopter was still approaching from a little farther back. The relief he felt could not be expressed in words. Perhaps they would be able to get through this. He shouted, trying to encourage his men. "Pour it on! Drive them back! Hold your line! Maintain your fire!" The Major moved up and down the line, ordering, hoping, helping. He watched the helicopters rain down fire and destruction. Yellow, orange, and black flowers of fire erupted up and down the highway. Bodies were tossed through the air with each successive explosion. Unfortunately, most of those bodies again lifted themselves onto their feet and continued forward. More than a few victims were engulfed in flames, and then they too arose and carried on, smoky contrails in their wake. This time, the Major said it. "Christ almighty!" His radio began to squawk wildly, but he couldn't understand it. He tried, but he just couldn't focus on anything but what was unfolding in front of him. There was little more than a football field of space separating him from the monsters still coming at him. The radio squawked again. This time he concentrated on the voice coming out. It was the colonel, whose voice was crackling. "Sir, I don't think we can hold." "I'm above you right now, Major. Your boys are doing a fine job. Keep it up." "We don't have enough ammunition to keep this up, sir." "The engineers just need a few more minutes to prepare the bridge for demolition. Do you understand, Major? We need you to hold for as long as you can. If they get through and that bridge is still intact, I'm not sure where or if we could stop them." Banishing the thoughts of escaping from his mind, the Major said somberly, "I understand, sir. We'll hold." "Thank you, son. If we can keep the fire up from here, maybe you and your boys could save some of your ammunition." "I don't think that is going to work, sir, but we'll do our jobs. Make sure that bridge gets blown." He climbed up into the gunner's position of the parked Humvee and pulled the hammer back on the heavy machine gun on the mount. He begged quietly, "Lord have mercy on my soul." His machine gun, loud as it was barely audible over the already deafening cacophony. A few of his bullets struck his targets in the head, and those targets actually fell and didn't get back up. He paused and decided to aim the gun a little higher and intentionally hit his victims' heads. Again, this seemed to work, permanently knocking down these attackers. "That's it. We need to hit them in the head. That works. Shoot them in the head! Shoot them in the head!" he shouted to his men, but they couldn't hear over their own shooting. Just seconds later, the first of those things crested the concrete traffic barricades and came crashing down amongst his men. The Major used his own M4 assault rifle to pick off several of those beasts that were even then tearing at some of his men. These weren't human beings they were fighting. They were something more preternatural and raw. They attacked primarily with their teeth, using them like predatory cats to latch onto and then tear at their victims. Again, he shouted, "The head! Shoot them in the head!" Some of his men heard him this time, but it was too late. Soldiers were being dragged down to the ground by 2 and 3 of the creatures at a time. The Major started to shoot the machine gun again until he fired all the rounds into the crowd. Another Humvee from the opposite end of the barricade was already overwhelmed by the things, and the striker vehicles were facing in the wrong direction to make a quick retreat, their open rear doors presenting a very tempting opportunity to several of the beasts. The soldiers inside were trapped and easy prey. Several of his men broke free from the roadblock and ran toward the Major's Humvee. His vehicle now represented the only real way out of the melee. There were 6 of them. They moved coolly, if abruptly. 3 would shoot while 3 moved, and then they would alternate. The trained soldiers fired conservatively, trying to save their precious ammunition. The Major tried to add some degree of support with his own rifle while he remained in the gunner's position of the Humvee. The 6 men were only a few feet from the vehicle when one of their number stumbled and fell behind. The other 5 continued to fire rounds into the closing mob, but they could not protect their fallen brother. He was overwhelmed, screaming and kicking, his rifle continuing to fire erratically as his legs and torso were viciously assailed, bitten, ripped, chewed, and devoured. The crowd's momentary distraction with their latest victim allowed the other soldiers time to retreat to the still idling Humvee and make their escape. No one said a word as they headed for the bridge. If the engineers had already destroyed the bridge, the sergeant driving the armored sport utility vehicle decided that he would just drive the vehicle as fast as he could off the ledge and hope for a soft water landing from which they could all swim to safety. There was no way in hell that he was going to go down like all those other poor saps back at the roadblock. He'd put a bullet in his brain pan before he'd let that happen. Chapter 34. No rest for the weary. That was a phrase she'd heard batted around the handful of offices at which she had worked. It could be heard on Monday mornings when co-workers attempted to unhappily shake off the lingering effects of the weekend, or when a reporting time deadline threatened to pass without the successful completion of the assigned work. No rest for the weary. None of them, not a one, had any clue about weariness or exhaustion. She knew now that for them, it was just about inconvenience and a fleeting sensation that would pass soon enough. There was always the possibility of naps, or just slowing down for the day, or even finding a delicious double mocha with whipped cream and chocolate sprinkles to chase away the malaise. There was always something on which you could count. Emma now had an unfortunately firm appreciation for the gravity of the no-rest sentiment. She couldn't remember ever having felt this tired, not even during her short stint of all-nighters while she enjoyed her even shorter stint in college. Maybe it was because, back then, it wasn't a matter of life and death. As it was, she hadn't really slept for 2 solid nights, and then had been on the run non-stop during the day. She wondered if this was how it was for prey species such as wildebeests, but then she felt a certain resentment for her animal kingdom example when she realized that even those creatures were granted slight respites for rest and eating. That was the other nagging distraction. She was hungry. She didn't just need a snack or trip to a McDonald's for a quick bite. She hadn't had anything other than water for a couple of days, and her moaning, acid-churning stomach was in full revolt. She realized after several more minutes that her eyes were indeed open and that she had been staring absently at the crude ceiling of simple, unfinished lumber over her. They weren't, after all, staying at the Captain Cook Hotel or some other establishment that prided itself on its refinements. The 3 of them, hunted fugitives in their own city, had taken a hasty refuge in a child's treehouse for the simple reasons that it was up off the ground, and the rope ladder could be and was retracted into the structure, rendering them unreachable by any would-be assailants. Once inside, their heart rates could slow slightly, and their breathing could relax to a more normal level. There was at least a fleeting sense of security up off the ground. The comfort was at least enough for them to collect themselves. It was anything but rest. In fact, she felt more tired now than she did before. Her adrenaline had faded from her bloodstream, and her fatigue was beginning to blunt her senses. As she stared, she noticed that the boards comprising the ceiling were damp with moisture. At about the same moment, she registered the fact that her exhaled breath was forming a warm, misty cloud immediately in front of her face. She tried to wrap herself tighter into the very limited warmth of the threadbare blanket that had previously served as a floor cover of sorts in the treehouse. As cold as she felt, she just knew that it would be unbearable without the minimal warmth the blanket provided. The moment, despite the cold, was almost serene. Provided, of course, that she forgot about the fact that she could possibly be in the midst of Armageddon on a truly biblical scale. Quietly, almost silently, tears again pooled in her eyes and rolled down the sides of her face. She wasn't sure why she was crying again. At first, other than the tightness in her chest, she wasn't even certain that she was crying. And when she did understand and accept that she was surrendering to her emotions, she realized that there wasn't a shortage of things about which she could cry. She didn't fight the tears, fearing it would only lead to the inevitable sobbing. She didn't want any attention, regardless of how well-meaning it would be. Maybe one good cry in the morning would suffice for the entire day. Dr. Caldwell, lying next to her and sharing the blanket, stirred slightly and began to breathe in short, shallow breaths. Another nightmare, she figured. At one point during the night, he was almost whimpering. She wondered to herself if his nightmare even came close to comparing with the hell they had been enduring for the past 2 days. Emma looked more closely at the man who was, for all intents and purposes, sharing a bed with her. He had a kind, knowing face with shallow lines of experience cut into the skin near his eyes. His hair was a patchy salt and pepper, primarily comprised of pepper. The dark hair growing in on his cheeks, chin, and neck was even and had the appearance of having been manicured, though she realized that it couldn't have been. She placed her hand lightly on his shoulder to comfort him without waking him. She made a motion to lie her head back down and snuggle closer against the doctor when she felt the unmistakable sensation that she was being watched. The feeling slithered up her spine like a cold serpent. She looked up and saw Officer Malachi Ivanov looking directly at her. Trying to ignore him and act as if she hadn't noticed his staring, she cautiously watched him from the corner of her eyes. At first, what she thought she was seeing was anger or possibly betrayal, but then, looking through her bangs, she could have sworn that his eyes were actually filled with hunger or possibly lust. As a woman, she had seen that leer in the eyes of men at bars and parties after alcohol had started the blunting effect on their better judgment. Perhaps she was just imagining it, but she was utterly unsettled by it. She laid her head back down, but didn't dare close her eyes. She waited a few seconds, trying to control her breathing. Feigning adjusting her position to find the elusive comfort on the bare planks of the floor, she chanced a glance over the doctor's neck. The officer was apparently asleep again. Maybe he'd been asleep all along and she was just imagining it, but she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling. No rest for the weary. Chapter 35. Anchorage was quiet as the grave. There was no longer any shooting. There were no longer any echoing screams followed by the rush of desperate footsteps. An uneasy peace had settled over the city. That's not to say that there was no activity within the city's limits. A group of 9 of the fiends, separated from the majority of the seemingly aimless specters wandering the city, was meandering in a dead-end residential housing court, one way in and one way out on the road. The miserable cold and gray sky very nearly perfectly matched the demon's skin. Once seething and glimmering red, the horrible wounds that had claimed the lives of the human beings that once inhabited the same skin were now soft and brown and malodorous. If the things wore clothing, most of it was in tattered rags, the remnants of a tie and a sport coat, the last clinging strips of a pink velour exercise suit. Brown Carhartt coveralls stained a deep rust from top to bottom. Their limbs and heads seemingly rippled with an electric current that pulsed through them as regular as a heartbeat. Every movement they made, however small, carried with it a slight, tremble like coiled springs trying in vain to contain their suppressed but eager energy. They were searching for the one thing that called to them, searching for their own sirens. Their heightened predatory senses told them that there was prey near. In their own stiff, jerky way, each of them raised a nose every few steps. The intoxicating scent of meat, of soft, salty flesh and firm, aromatic, blood-basted muscle and the delicate, bitter sweetness of the delicious organs, all of it called to them, bade them to wait and to hunger. "Are they still out there?" Jerry peeked through the edge of the curtains, nodded, and sighed. Neil felt the same way, and there was no denying it. He wished he could be more confident, at least outwardly so, or able to mask his disappointment in front of Megan. He just wasn't a hero, at least in the classic sense of the term. He wasn't capable of being perpetually upbeat and positive. He didn't have superhuman strength, extrasensory perception, and he wasn't a genius. Many people would refer to him as broken or damaged. He wouldn't necessarily agree with that quick assessment. He would probably argue that he was just not interested anymore. That was probably the main reason why he hadn't ever spoken to the beautiful Laney in his building. He just wanted to avoid the disappointment and the heartache that caring about something, about another person, or about himself would ultimately bring. He wasn't a pessimist for the simple reason that it required more effort than he was willing to put forth. His expectation about life had just been irretrievably altered since his divorce. He became aware of a low but steady hum that tickled the air with its sound vibrations. The noise was annoying and impossible to ignore. "What is that noise? Can everyone hear it, or is it just me?" Tony stood up and walked back into the dining room. "No, we can all hear it all right, and it's starting to get on my nerves." "I think that the hum has been there all along," Jerry said, "but there needed to be enough of them for us to hear them." "How many now?" 9, and I think there are some more coming this direction from the road." Tony turned as he made his way down the narrow kitchen and asked, "Now there are 9? "Yeah, and more coming. I think the moaning is working as a kind of beacon for others." Rachel reeled back in her recliner and asked, "What the fuck did you just say?" "Sorry, kids," Megan answered. "It's okay, they're back in the bedroom sleeping." "Okay, then what the fuck did you just say?" As usual, Jerry hesitated before he began. It was just difficult for him to commit himself to anything. Sticking his neck out in the past had gotten him nothing but trouble, and he wasn't an expert. Just because he played some games, watched some movies, and read some books didn't mean that he was some fucking Dr. Van Helsing of zombies. He was just a kid and wanted to go back to that. He always did. He missed not having to make decisions, or at least not having to be held terribly accountable for those decisions. "I'm guessing that the noise has been there all along," he said. "It was probably just subsonic because there weren't enough of them yet. Or maybe it's because the city is quieter. Whatever. It doesn't really resemble a sound that I could place. It's not really a sound at all. It's more like a vibration than it is a sound. Can everyone else feel it?" Megan nodded her head. "Yeah, I think you're right. It's actually nauseating me a little." She leaned toward Neil and rested against him. Tentatively, he raised his hand and wrapped it around her shoulders. She nestled into him in search of comfort. "Well," Jerry continued, "the vibrations were probably always there. It just took more of them to become powerful enough for our ears to detect it." Tony asked, already suspecting the answer. "Our ears? Aren't they just us?" "Yeah, but they died and came back, and all the result of some kind of virus or some other highly transmittable organism. Who knows what all changes took place as a result of the infection? I think it is safe to assume that their senses are probably heightened." Kim, coming from the dining room where she had been a silent observer of the conversation thus far, asked, "Why do you say that?" "Well, they're predators now in a more primal and animalistic sense. They're hunters, and hunter species have long relied on their senses to detect,
track, and ultimately kill their prey. Us, Megan said soberly.
Neil asked the room, "What are we going to do?" Rachel, virtually melted to the fabric of her recliner so far she was sunken into the chair, answered,
"Why the hell are you asking us? You're the guy who's had the answers all along. You tell us. What are we going to do?"
"I don't know for sure, Rachel. I'm new at this, too. I guess for the time being, we just wait and see. We can afford to stall and not rush into things. Maybe time will work to our advantage."
"And what do you mean by that?"
Looking up at him and smiling, Megan asked,
"Yeah, what's running through that head of yours?"
Neil guided Megan back into a standing position and stepped away for a second. "These things, they're just dead bodies, right? Well, dead bodies rot. They decompose, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Maybe as that starts to happen, these things will start to slow down or give us some other sort of advantage. Maybe as their muscle tissue becomes tighter with water loss, they'll slow down, start acting like zombies in the Romero movies. They were slow and usually overwhelmed their victims through sheer numbers." Jerry interjected,
"Yeah, you may be right. I guess I hope you're right. I wonder how long until desiccation begins to take its toll. Do you think that their, feeding impacts the process?"
Rachel interrupted the discussion with a very direct,
"What the fuck does it matter? You're not getting my ass back out there. And if the rest of you are smart, you just stay hidden too."
She started to cry, which forced her words out in sputtering starts and stops.
"I mean, does any of that even matter? Is this Armageddon?"
The last word spilled from her lips and made its way through the room like a shadow, darkening as it crept. She looked up from the floor and let the tears course down her cheeks. Her eyes were swollen and her cheeks were red and splotchy. She looked at Neil and asked,
"Is this really the end of the world like in the Bible?"
To hear a question like that, one typically had to be walking in downtown San Francisco or some other larger-than-life metropolis, and the asker would be wearing a large cardboard sign written in scrawled marker with a date for the end of the world. It wasn't a question that normally arose in casual conversation. Neil had read a story a long time ago in which everyone on Earth knew that the end of the world was happening that night after everyone was asleep. Even with that knowledge, the entire population simply went to sleep like normal, to never wake again. That was really the first time he had truly contemplated the end of existence. He read the story in a college class. The discussion that followed culminated in an examination of what each of them would do today if they knew that tomorrow would never come. And now here it was, a very real possibility that he was living that exact scenario. "Ain't life a bitch?" he thought to himself. "I've actually met someone that it feels natural to connect with so well, so quickly, and time has run out." He looked at Megan. He knew that everyone in the room was looking at him again, but he didn't care. He needed to know if he was just imagining the energy between them. Maybe he was just creating the illusion to comfort his mind. When he looked in her eyes, though, he realized it didn't really matter because she was looking at him and her eyes were kind and warm and comfortable. If it was the end of the world, he couldn't think of a better feeling to have when it all shook down. He didn't feel the need to answer Rachel immediately. He did, however, look away from Megan and felt better than he had in a long time. Megan looked over at Rachel and said, "I'm not necessarily saying that I even believe in that line of thinking, but regardless, I'm not going down without a fight. Don't expect me to pray for salvation and ditch on this world. I say let's figure a way out of this. If we wait, then we wait. And if we need to figure out when and how to boogie, well, I'm down with that too. We just all need to keep talking and thinking and watching out for one another." Neil interrupted. "First things first. It feels a little cool in here today." Tony, still in the dining room, said, "Yeah, the turtle thermostat hanging on the window here says that it's only 50 degrees outside. And it's only going to get cooler. What do we do?" Neil didn't know. If they were to survive, they needed to stay warm. but they also couldn't risk detection by those things. To the room, but more specifically to Jerry, he asked, "Do you think that smoke from a fire would give us away?" Tony, with a smile on his face, jokingly said, "Maybe if ours isn't the only fire." Megan and Kim both looked at him and said in unison, "Huh?" "Well, I'm a bit of a pyro, and if it would help, I might be willing to venture out and start us a fire down the road a bit." Kim demanded, "Are you out of your fucking mind?" "Come on, Kim, you know how much of a pyro I am. Here's my big chance to start a real fire and not get in trouble for it. Hell, even be encouraged to set it. You telling me that you want me to pass that kind of opportunity by?" "Yeah, but that doesn't mean you gotta get yourself killed to satisfy your fetish. Besides, we don't even know if this is gonna work." "Relax, I'll be safe. It's not like I want to die or anything." With that comment, Neil was suddenly reminded of the facetious rule that he would demand be followed in athletic contests, however mundane they may have been. "No one is allowed to die," was the largely comedic rule that all at once became much more profound. The words as bright and buzzing as neon flashed in his head, threatening to become a motivational mantra. Ignoring the neon, Neil said, "She's right, Tony. This isn't worth getting yourself killed over. We can probably think of something else." This was really only going to buy us some time anyway, and that was only if it worked. "If I thought I could actually end up dead doing this, do you think I'd be volunteering?" Kim started to speak, but thought better of it and went back into the bedroom in which Jules and Danny were still sleeping. With his hands pressed tightly together in front of himself, Neil began, "Okay, let's come up with a plan then. Any ideas?" Chapter 36. Crouched and moving with as much speed as stealth would allow, Neil made it to the storage shed in the back of the yard. Just as Jerry had said, there was a grass-caked red lawnmower. He looked around in the obscuring darkness and finally found it. He grabbed the metal handle on the gas can and was relieved to find that it was mostly full. Lugging it back to Tony, waiting by the 6-foot privacy fence separating this yard from the next one, he tried not to cause the flammable liquid to slosh too much. But, like a fart in church, he imagined that everyone and everything in the vicinity could hear it. He reached the fence. "Okay, we ready to go?" Tony nodded and smiled. They both looked up at Jerry standing at the ready on the deck behind them. From his vantage point, he could pretty well see into all the yards around them. He lifted the scoped hunting rifle above his head as he had seen soldiers do in World War II movies. Without lowering the rifle, he gave them a thumbs-up signal and waved them over. Megan was there with Jerry as well. She waved to Neil and then blew him a kiss. She looked over them and into the yard to which they were heading. It was still empty, or at least it appeared empty. She couldn't see the spaces close to the fence, the far side of the yard behind the shed and full tree, and, of course, the shadows in the house were a terrifying possibility to all of them. She didn't see Neil and Tony go over the fence. She did, however, see both sets of hands come to the top of the fence and pull the ladder over. Chapter 37. Reaching up to pull the ladder from the fence, Neil involuntarily withdrew his hands as if he had been burned. The cocktail of adrenaline and fear was forcing his hands into shaking fits that could rival a Parkinson's tic. He was afraid that he might rattle the metal parts of their fence-scaling ladder they'd found hanging on the inside wall of the garage. They couldn't afford the attention that such noise might bring. Tony looked out into the new yard. "I'm scared shitless," he whispered. Neil's heart was threatening to use his throat as an expressway as it made its way up and out his mouth. He swallowed cautiously, not wanting to tempt fate. At the back of his throat, a not too subtle pungence arose and settled in his mouth, the flavor of fear. Neil whispered, "Speed. The quicker we get in, the quicker we get out. I don't know about you, but I want to be back in our house as quick as we can." "I'm with you, boss." they started to run, one at each end of the ladder. They realized at the same time that the yard they were in was not entirely enclosed. There were only fences on 3 sides, the front open to the street. They both stopped, looked at the empty street in front of the house, looked at one another, and decided to finish the job anyway. The absence of any of those things helped to embolden their resolve. Tony clambered over the ladder and Neil quickly followed. This was the yard and this was the house. There was a big pile of firewood stacked against the back wall of the house. Without even seeing his face, Neil could feel Tony's delightful smile. Chapter 38. Megan looked over at Jerry when she saw the smoke coming from 2 houses over. In another life, seeing smoke would have had her running to the telephone to call the fire department. It would have drawn a crowd of concerned neighbors to the street. It would have normally solicited a response other than relief and hope. Jerry's own expression mirrored hers. She looked past him, hoping to see Neil coming over the fence. "Oh, shit!" Jerry started to ask, but then looked for himself. One of the ghouls, what appeared to be a former grocery clerk, was stumbling into the backyard that was between Neil and Tony and themselves. Its left leg was obviously broken and partially missing. It hopped on its good leg and used the damaged limb to balance itself precariously between jumps. Like a movie mummy's tattered linen rags, the fiend's shredded clothing hung from it, swaying with each uneven movement. Like stone golems, Jerry and Megan froze. Neither knew if the thing recognized them for what they were. Was it scent or movement that attracted the attention? Jerry had wondered to himself if the zombies might be able to detect heat signatures using an animalistic form of infrared. Bats used a sophisticated but natural form of sonar to navigate the blackness of night. Who's to say that the infection that caused reanimation didn't alter the senses in the process? As the past few days had taught all of them, nothing was beyond the realm of possibilities anymore. At first, it didn't appear that the beast could see them. They could tell that it saw something that caught its eye, but were relatively certain that its primal brain still hadn't sorted it all out. Its eyes were transfixed on them, though. And then Tony was coming over the fence in a hurry. He very nearly ran into the former grocery clerk, who spun on his one good limb like a deranged music box ballerina. It lost its balance, as did Tony, and fell to the ground. The two scrambled, each in his own way, back to their feet. Neil, in the meantime, was cresting the fence and coming down in the midst of the struggle. He realized the possibility of what was unfolding before he saw the fiend. "Fuck!" Neil shouted as he landed. The thing turned and faced Neil, whose spine seized with fear instantly. Try as he might, he couldn't lift his feet or even his arms. He was as stuck as a fly in a web and felt just as vulnerable and helpless as well. He couldn't swallow. He could barely draw a breath. The creature's smell was as intimidating as its appearance, neither of which was anything short of frightening. The putrescent dark wounds on its neck near its ear and the now shattered leg colored the air all around it with the sickening, rotten smell that typically accompanied the early spring or fall. That smell of fresh death and decay stewing in the fermenting broth of the latest rain or heavy dew, only this odor was magnified 100 times. Relentlessly churning the acid collected therein, Neil's stomach began to make audible sucking sounds. The ghoul reached out for Neil, who only then realized that on its left hand were only 2 fingers, the others having been gnawed down to below the first knuckle. A further chill then roughly handled Neil's immobile spine. He still couldn't move. He could only watch. He was a spectator at his own death. Its hands grabbed hold of Neil's jacket and tried to pull him closer to its chomping jaws. Neil's arms somehow broke free of their paralysis and grabbed hold of his attacker's ragged smock in an attempt to hold him at bay. Looking like a pair of tussling hockey players, they shifted positions slightly and Seconds later it was over. Neil let go, and the beast's lifeless body fell at his feet. The thing's head was just about gone from the ear up. Neil saw Tony, who was pointing up at Jerry on the deck. He still had the hunting rifle on his shoulder at the ready. Neil waved to him thankfully and looked back down at the purulent pile of flesh. It was hard to remember that it was at one time a man, a young man, not much more than a teen, really. With a slap to his shoulder, Tony exhorted Neil. "Come on, goddammit! Can't you hear that?" Neil shook the daze and focused. It was the sound of hundreds of footsteps on pavement, and the sound was growing as its source grew nearer. Neil nodded, and they both ran off, carrying the ladder haphazardly and leaning it against the fence again, without the same care or caution they had exercised in their coming. With adrenaline-amplified muscles, the two of them were able to negotiate the 6-foot-high cedar fence fairly easily, hardly even using the ladder to crest the wooden barrier. When Neil came down on the opposite side, he felt a sense of relief and wonderment overtake him. He and Tony grabbed the metal top of their climbing aid and pulled it over, letting it rattle and crash just inside their side of the fence. Despite the fact that the back deck on which Megan and Jerry were still standing was missing its bottom several steps, a cautionary move suggested by Jerry earlier, Tony and Neil were able to get themselves up and out of the yard without even slowing their pace. Like seasoned gymnasts, they leapt up and were on the deck in a matter of seconds. "Are we good?" asked Jerry. With shaking hands and a spine that was still twitching and tingling with fear and adrenaline, Neil said, "Let's just get back inside." Chapter 39. Back in the living room of their newfound house-turned-bunker, Neil was finding it hard to catch his breath. He couldn't shake the hold from his mind of the creature's face and its cold, dead eyes, the eyes of a predator, of a shark, not a man. There wasn't a shred of humanity in him at all. He wasn't even quite sure if it was even fitting to be referring to it as he or him. Megan put her hand on his shoulder and started to rub in gentle circles. When he looked up at her, though, she realized that he wasn't even aware she was touching him. Neil pulled away abruptly and walked over to the window. He looked through the crack in the blind down the street toward the now burning house. It seemed to be working. All of them that were in the street were starting to drift toward the fire. There were perhaps 50 of them by then. Every time he happened to look out into the street, there seemed to be more. Soon the house would be as much a prison as a sanctuary. How much longer could they hold out? He needed a distraction. "Hey, Tony, how about a repeat performance but on a much smaller scale?" Neil pointed to the fireplace and nodded. Tony, who had been close to mauled by the very relieved and emotional Kim, pulled himself away and nodded. "Yeah, good idea. Let's get this place a little warmer. Figure we earned it." With a sarcastic bark, Neil answered, "Yeah," and continued to chuckle uncomfortably. "I figure that's the last time we're going to be doing that, huh?" Neil nodded, but couldn't hide the pools gathering in the corners of his eyes. He shook his head, but couldn't speak at first. With Megan again at his side and with her arm around his shoulders, he exhaled a long, stilted breath and said with an equally uncomfortable and forced smile, "Like Chef said, never get off the boat. Never. You might just run into a tiger like he did." The comment and the joke were lost on everyone except Jerry, who'd actually seen Apocalypse Now. He thought to himself that staying on the boat, regardless of what boat it was, always seemed to be a great idea, but it very rarely worked out that way. There was always something out there that lured you or scared you off the boat, and then the jungle would eat your soul. Chapter 40. "I don't see any of them. I think it's okay." "Look again. Just make sure. I don't want to get down and—" Dr. Caldwell nodded and leaned down for another peek. The yard appeared to be empty. He moved himself so that he could get a 360-degree look and still didn't see anything. He didn't look back this time, but decided just to drop himself down. He stepped behind the tree in which the tree fort was sitting. He looked up into the trapdoor opening on the bottom of their sanctuary. He nodded to Emma and signaled with his hand for her to join him, which she did, with Officer Ivanov following quickly on her heels. Just looking around at what was once a friendly suburban backyard and the scene of games, fun, and laughter, and knowing that at every corner and behind every door possibly lurked unimaginable horrors, Dr. Caldwell felt his breath catch in the back of his throat. Nothing was, nor would it ever be the same again. Emma's stomach begged for food with an audible sucking and churning sound.
I could really use a Danish and a mocha grande right about now,
Officer Ivanov said. Fat chance of that. Staring intently at the back door of the house in whose backyard they were standing, Dr. Caldwell said, She might have a point. It seems to be quiet, and we don't know when we might get another chance to eat. Maybe we should check out what's inside. Do you think it's safe? Asked the doubtful police officer. I don't know, but how long can we possibly last with no food in our bellies? This part of town seems to be deserted, thankfully. Maybe our absent hosts have some food in there for us. And if one of those things is in there? Emma looked at Dr. Caldwell, wondering about his response as well. He held up the large silver revolver and said, I guess if you guys hear this thing go off, you better get running. And here. The doctor handed the water bottle he had been carrying in his jacket pocket to Emma. Just in case. With that, walking like a bad actor in an even worse police crime drama, Dr. Caldwell made his way across the yard and went into the unlocked back door. He disappeared for a few seconds, but reappeared unmolested, much to Emma's and Malachi's relief. Come on, there's food upstairs still on the kitchen counters, like they knew to expect us. Emma shuddered to herself at the thought of what that meant. A few days ago, some ordinary family was rising early with the day. They were probably getting lunches together for later and talking about their day when they heard the news of the mayhem. They probably flew out the back door, never looking back at the partially finished lunches or the ordinary lives that they were leaving behind forever. Once inside, she looked around and further fleshed out the images in her mind. There were children's toys, for both boys and girls, scattered here and there. Next to the now crusty sandwiches in mid-preparation sat Star Wars and Barbie lunchboxes. Dr. Caldwell pulled a tab on the top of a can of fruit cocktail and emptied the contents into his mouth and onto his cheeks. He chomped the chunks of peaches, pears, grapes, and cherries in grand style. From the non-functioning and stale refrigerator he produced a bottle of still-cool orange soda and sucked it down greedily straight from the bottle. He belched loudly and handed the 2-liter bottle to the police officer. Officer Ivanov was chewing a granola cereal bar and eagerly drank from the soda bottle. He went to the window that looked out over the front yard and the street beyond. He turned around and asked sourly, So, you want the good news or the bad news? Emma said defiantly,
Can't it wait until I at least have a full stomach? I don't think marshmallows have ever tasted this good.
Whatever you say, Your Majesty.
If I wasn't having such a good time eating, I'd tell you to go fuck yourself, but you're going to have to do that for me. I'm not that interested in dealing with you right at this moment.
Stung, the police officer said, You know, under different circumstances. With a little sass, she asked,
What? We could have been friends or something?
No. Hell no. Under different circumstances, you'd never be allowed to speak to me like that.
You know, that shit may fly out in the bush, but you can plain forget about it with me, got it?
Declared Emma, not once slowing her chewing as she tossed in mini marshmallows one after the other. Dr. Caldwell, still hung up on the good news and bad news, asked calmly,
Officer, I'd like to hear both the good and the bad news.
Well, The good news is that I think we're safe for the moment, and I don't think they know that we're here.
They?
Yeah, that's the bad news. There's a crowd of those things out in the street. They just look like they're waiting for something.
Waiting for something?
Echoed Dr. Caldwell. And Emma shared all of their thoughts.
Yeah, waiting for us to fuck up and become dinner.
The doctor, shaking his head and half-heartedly chuckling, said,
You sure got a way of cutting to the chase of things, don't you? It's a gift. What can I say?
Sneering as he left the room, Officer Ivanov said, Some gift. Too bad. His words trailed off as he made his way down the hallway. Dr. Caldwell, realizing where the police officer was heading, said in a rush,
Officer, I haven't been in any of those rooms yet.
Yeah?
Meaning I don't know what's on the other side of any of those doors.
The police officer's hand stopped abruptly, just inches from a doorknob. The hand, with a mind and an instinct all its own, fell to his side and pulled the 9mm pistol from its hip holster. The cool, oily metal of the pistol grip was comforting. The lingering tingles of fear that had sought refuge in the hand's fingertips lost their grip and quickly faded. With his gun raised and in a firing stance, Officer Ivanov backed out of the hallway and back into the main room. You didn't think to check it all out first?
I listened at each door and didn't hear anything. The house seems abandoned, but...
Finishing his thought, but you didn't see fit to check it all out before inviting us in. Interjecting herself into the conversation, Emma retorted,
Hey, he hasn't been trained in any of this. Would you have done any better?
I would have at least checked the whole place out first.
As I recall, you weren't exactly jumping to come in here in the first place. At least the doc here got us in.
Walking down the hall, she continued,
And if neither of you have the balls to check the place out, then I guess it's just up to me.
As she finished the last sentence, she threw open the first door to reveal a coat closet, doing its best to contain all the contents of its overstuffed space. The long handle of a tilted floor vacuum cleaner fell and caused each of their hearts to skip a beat. Emma plastered herself to the opposite wall, trying to avoid the slow reach. When she opened her eyes again and realized her error, she said,
Okay, I think I just wet myself.
Dr. Caldwell demanded, What in the hell were you thinking?
I don't know. I think it was just a sugar buzz from all of those marshmallows. Maybe we should open the other doors together.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Officer Ivanov went back over to the front window to keep an eye on the ghouls in the street. It appeared that they were in yet another cul-de-sac of the same ghost town. He looked out onto the same scene that he'd seen several times before. Some of the house's front doors were still open, as were most of the garage doors. There were clothes and toys in all of the yards, along with discarded luggage and family heirlooms. When all was said and done, none of that mattered anymore. It was all about the escape. He wondered how many of those that tried had actually been able to get away. He wasn't quite sure how that made him feel. Pondering his luck, his resourcefulness, and his mortality, he looked down the street and saw the smoke, and then the flames. There was a house on the opposite side of the street, and then about a half a block away that was burning. The fire was actually attracting most of those beasts to it. That was, in Officer Ivanov's opinion, the happiest coincidence they had encountered yet. The noise and the smoke should be a good distraction for them when they decided to make a move. Chapter 41. The downstairs of their new accommodations was largely all garage and virtually no windows. There was the back door through which they had entered that had to be secured, and then there was a small window in the utility room. That window was too tight to admit anything but the smallest of assailants. Even so, figuring that they weren't going to be checking the hot water heater or doing any laundry, Dr. Caldwell figured they would just need to seal that room. Officer Ivanov used a scavenged hammer and screwdriver to remove a door from its hinges from one of the empty bedrooms upstairs. Dr. Caldwell and Emma then nailed the door across the door and window of the back door. To lessen the volume of hammering, the doctor laid some cloth over the nails. They worked as quietly as they could. After a handful of hours, the house felt secure, if a little cold, and they could all relax a little. Emma went to the front window and peered through. She felt that spectator at the scene of an accident urge overcome her as she watched the beasts in the street. Their movements seemed stiffer now, more robotic and less organic. Their appearance, though, was still nightmarish and enough to freeze her in her tracks if she wasn't careful. She counted at least 30 of them loitering in the street and knew that there were more out of sight beyond her view. The fire down the road seemed to be close to running its course. The house in which the fire was currently raging was nearly completely burned by then. She looked closer at the house next to it to make sure that the fire was not spreading. She couldn't be certain, but it didn't appear that the fire had reached across the privacy fence separating the two properties. She looked to the next house down the line and didn't see any indication of fire either until she looked up at its roof. She was so surprised and excited she about fell over. She looked into the room at Dr. Caldwell and, without uttering a word, looked back out to make certain that her eyes were not deceiving her. From the chimney atop the roof, smoke was meandering its way up and out toward the clouds. She tried to determine if there was any other sign of fire. No, it just appeared that the fireplace had a fire in it. And if there was a fire in the fireplace, then it just stood to reason that there were people inside.
Doc, I think there are more than just us and those things here on this block.
Trying to dial in a faint signal on a battery-powered radio, Dr. Caldwell looked up and asked what she meant.
I think there might be people over in that house across the street from us.
Why do you think that? Asked a disbelieving Malachi, emerging from the kitchen.
Well, the bottom windows are boarded up, and I see smoke coming from the fireplace.
Probably just smoke that drifted over the house from the fire down the way. You're just seeing what you want to see. The doctor, now standing next to Emma and looking out the window, said, No, Mal. She may be onto something. The wind is blowing the smoke in the opposite direction. I think I do see smoke coming from the chimney. It could just be a smoldering fire from a wood-burning stove. Yeah, and it could be the only other survivors that we've encountered since this whole thing began. Doesn't that excite you in the slightest? Even if there are people over there, what does it matter? Emma, stupefied by the police officer's attitude, asked,
What does it matter? Those are other people over there, possibly. Maybe they've got news or have some of this figured out.
And what good does it do us? Even if there is somebody over there, how do we talk to them? With those things between us and them, they might as well be on the other side of the Cook Inlet. Dr. Caldwell, not wanting to let something as elusive as hope get away, added, Yeah, but that's a problem that can be dealt with. I don't want to rush into anything, but if we keep an eye across the street, maybe, just maybe, we can determine if there is indeed someone there. Once we've done that, it's just a matter of figuring the safest way to get over there.
Thank you, Doc. I was afraid that I was all alone on this one.
None of us are alone in anything. We do everything together. Chapter 42. Favorite movie of all time? The problem with that question is that there are so many favorites out there. It's like asking your favorite song, you know? It kind of depends on your mood. Jerry, shaking his head, demanded with a smile, Nope, not again. You're not going to weasel yourself out of answering. Mouth agape in mock disgust, Neil said, Again? What do you mean again? When have I weaseled? What about right now? You're stalling. I'm calling your bluff. Come on. Favorite movie? Damn. I really like movies. When I just closed my eyes, the title that came to me was The Usual Suspects. Megan asked, What else, Mr. Movie Man? What genre? Jerry fired off. Comedy. Classic or modern? Ooh, specific. Both. I really like Bringing Up Baby with Hepburn and Grant. The first time I saw it was with my dad at my grandparents' house. We were sitting at the kitchen table and watching it while Grandma cooked and smoked, back when people still smoked in their houses. I remember hearing my dad laughing out in the kitchen, so I wandered in to check out what was so funny. He had one of those laughs, you know? You just had to find out what could solicit such laughter. So I sat down and just started watching. Kate Hepburn was just so funny and sweet, you know? And Grant, he was such a good straight man. Do you remember him in Arsenic and Old Lace? He trailed off, lost in the past. Megan was thinking to herself that she may just love this guy, but decided to distract herself and the conversation with, "And modern?" The memory hadn't completely faded. It was stalling there on the periphery, teasing. He thought a moment longer and then looked at Megan and said, "Maybe Wonder Boys?" Megan asked, surprised. "Wonder Boys? That's a comedy? What's wrong with that?" "Well, when I think about ha-ha comedies, Wonder Boys isn't one that comes to mind." "Well, what would you say then?" "What about Uncle Buck?" "I can live with that." Jerry said, "But Wonder Boys is a hell of a movie, one of Douglas's best." Megan still persisted. "But a comedy?" Defending himself now, Neil said, "In the classic sense of a comedy, yes it is. Everyone wins and the hero gets the girl and all of the action and dialogue is humorous, light, and somewhat lyrical." Giggling, Megan teased, "Listen to you, light and lyrical. Why is it that you weren't teaching or something?" "What could I possibly be qualified to teach?" Jerry said somberly, "Apocalypse Survival 101? They all nodded reluctantly. Neil was still nodding when he asked, "Uncle Buck, huh?" "Yeah, and what's wrong with that?" And Megan's hands slid to her hips in defiant protest. "I wasn't suggesting there was anything wrong with—" Abruptly closing the distance between them until she was almost pushing him over, Megan playfully threatened, "That's right, you weren't suggesting. If you know what's good for you, anyway." Like a good boxing referee, Jerry separated the two and sent each of them to their corners. Neil, as a way of perhaps mock appeasement, said, "Uncle Buck is Candy at his best." Jerry added, "I was just a little kid when John Candy kicked it, but I remember it. He was a funny guy, that's for sure." Not wanting the game to stop, Jerry asked, "Okay, what about other movies? I love talking movies." "You do it often?" asked Megan. "No, not really. Only when I get to hang out with MDs at Providence during the rare downtime. Most of my friends were into whatever was at the theaters or on the radio right now, you know? I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that I'm better than them or that I don't on occasion like whatever is right now, but I'm not a slave to seeing or having the latest and greatest of anything. Sometimes the greatest happened a long time before the latest ever came along." Chapter 43. Jules was sleeping peacefully in a bed with pink sheets and flowered pillowcases. The dog, which everyone had taken to calling Lucky, was on the floor next to the bed and sleeping as well. Danny, however, couldn't get himself comfortable enough to sleep. His mind wouldn't stop turning over questions, and every time he did close his eyes for longer than a simple blink, he always saw that face from out at the glacier. That was where it had all started. That day seemed so long ago. He wasn't even sure how long ago it was or even what day it was. He sat up in bed and tried to think about something else. He tried to think about home and his parents. He tried to think about his own dog, a great golden retriever named Max, who was, hopefully, waiting for him back home. He even thought about his older sister, wondering if he'd ever see them again. He was crying before he even realized that the tears were streaming down his cheeks and wetting his shirt. He didn't like this one bit. He just wanted to be back at home. He knew deep down that all of these people were looking out for him and Jules, but nothing could take the place of his mother's compassion. Her voice just made everything better for him. He needed her voice and her comfort. She could make everything all right regardless of the situation. He found himself getting upset that he had accepted the invitation to come to Alaska at all. His mom had said that it was up to him whether he went or not. She wasn't going to force him, though she did say that she thought he might regret it if he didn't. Boy, was she wrong. He wondered if his family was still safe or if the whole world had been turned upside down by what was happening here in Alaska. Was this same thing happening everywhere? Jules stirred slightly and rolled over onto her side. The dog's head rose from the floor to inspect the new noise. Danny caught the dog's attention and motioned for him to join Danny on the bed. The dog hopped up eagerly, obviously a treat that he was not accustomed to enjoying. He circled 3 or 4 times before finally plopping himself down heavily next to Danny's leg. Possibly sensing Danny's unease, Lucky laid his head across Danny's thigh and breathed a long, loud sigh. Lucky wasn't Max by a long shot, but he was friendly and seemed to need attention. He was quite obviously a child's dog and was missing his human counterpart. Danny scratched him behind the ears like he'd seen Jerry do, and then curled up next to him. The dog's breathing, deep and rhythmic, helped to relax Danny enough to let him drift off to sleep. The dog, too, found his way back to sleep. Chapter 44. "What's up, Buttercup?" Kim looked back at her friend Tony, who was walking down the hallway toward her. "I thought I heard crying or sobbing coming from back here." "Looks like the kids are still asleep." "Yeah. Do you think they understand what's going on?" "God, I hope not. I mean, their family. It all started with them. Can you imagine?" No way. Who would have even thought this would be happening? I don't even know that I can believe it, and I'm living through it. Well, hopefully, anyway. Kim cocked her eyebrow at that comment and answered, "Speaking of which, you've done your hero bit now, right? Can we agree to let the other heroes step up and do their parts now? I don't think I can handle a repeat performance of yesterday. And I know that I can't handle losing you after losing everything else." "You won't get any arguments from me." "Tony, is everything going to work out? Are we going to make it through this all right?" "If we stick together, I think we've got a better chance than trying to do this alone." "That's not really much of an answer, you know." "What do you want, exactly?" "I want you to tell me that everything is going to be all right and that we're going to make it through all this and that there's still going to be a world left to live in. Can you do that?" Tony put his big arms around Kim and pulled her into his chest. She didn't resist even a little. She melted against him and tried to claw even closer. With his cheek resting on the top of her head, he said, "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, that's for sure, because I can't imagine a world without you in it." It wasn't the answer that you wanted, but it would do. Kim, once again, damned her bad luck for having fallen in love with yet another man who didn't want to have anything to do with her romantically. She'd loved boys with girlfriends, young men with fiancés, and men with wives. Sometimes there were brief moments of romance, fiery, sweet, but all of those relationships had ended the same. And now she was falling for a gay man. Dumb luck. Pure and simple. Chapter 45. "What's wrong, sweetie?" asked Megan, her blue eyes soft and concerned. It was later in the day, and the house around them was buzzing, albeit quietly, with life and activity. Jerry had found a portable DVD player with a charged battery pack and battery backup, so he, Jules, Danny, and Rachel were all watching a Pixar movie in the front room. Kim and Tony were trying to scrape together a meal in the kitchen. A Coleman cook stove was busy heating a can of beans while peanut butter and jelly were being slathered on bread. Tony hummed while Kim quietly sang to the tune. It was all just too normal, too routine for Neil to take. He retreated to the garage and, of course, Megan had followed him. With the CD player in the minivan melodically making its way through a tune, the two of them continued their conversation. Neil just wanted someone to understand what he was feeling. The discomforting thoughts that just wouldn't give his mind peace. He looked away, trying to hide his shame for the tears forming in the corner of his eyes. He wasn't accustomed to crying. It just wasn't something that he did. And yet, the urge to cry was a feeling that hovered so closely over the past few days that the feeling alone was enough to set him off at a moment's notice. Finding the base root of his emotions, he tried to sum it up with, "I've never been this scared before." "Oh, honey." She tried to soothe Neil with a soft caress on the back of his neck. He turned back to her and tried to make her understand. "You didn't see. You couldn't have seen." "What, sweetie?" "Those eyes. And that smell. It was the most horrific odor that's ever been, I'm sure. It was all the bad smells, rotting fish, decaying plants in the spring, body odor, shit. All of it put together and then made worse. And that sound that it made. It was as much a sensation that I could feel as I could hear. It rumbled down in the pit of my stomach and rattled my knees. But its eyes. I've never seen anything so empty and soulless, but at the same time so angry and full of rage. All the fear in the world was there in the blackness." She nodded and started to speak, but thought better of it and chose to let him continue instead. "We can't stay here indefinitely, and I don't think anyone is coming to help us. Hell, there may not even be anyone left out there anyway. We're running out of options, and I am petrified about going back out there again." "Sweetie, we're all—" "No, you don't understand. I've never been this afraid of anything, ever. Not even when I was a boy and all things were possible was I this afraid. Back then I knew that Mom in the next room would always come to rescue me from the boogeyman in the closet or the monster under the bed. Just knowing that she was there was enough to hold the fear at least partially at bay. I didn't know that fear like this even existed, was even possible." They were quiet for a few minutes while Jack Johnson on the CD sung about all the good people and wondered where they'd gone. Megan took Neil's hand in hers. "Are you more afraid of what might happen to you, or about making a wrong decision that might lead to something happening to one of us? One of the kids, maybe?" He thought about that for a few seconds. At first, he was inclined to say that he was terrified about his own well-being. After all, who likes to consider the prospect of being eaten alive? He remembered the curly-haired blonde guy in the parking lot of his office building. He could still see the man flailing his hands about wildly, trying to fend off his attacker, and then he remembered seeing the man's hands held in the air uselessly and coming together in weaker and weaker fists as he was disemboweled and eaten. Neil felt true nausea come over him when he imagined Megan lying there instead. He couldn't picture himself there, but seeing Megan suffer such a fate was too much. He lowered his head until his cheek rested against Megan's chest. Her heartbeat was strong, and her breaths were deep. He tried to match his own breathing to hers so that he might be able to get control of his own heartbeat. "I don't know what I'm more afraid of anymore. Losing me or losing you." She hugged him tighter against her, the way that she used to do to her fiancé when life was too much for him to bear on his own. She closed her eyes and let the tears come. They dripped down her cheeks and onto Neil's back. "Oh, sweetie, what are we going to do with you? My poor hero." Jack Johnson's disembodied voice was still asking the world about the good people. The song had a light feel to it, but the question and the frustration were serious and ardent. It was the only sound in the minivan other than their breathing. Neil wondered, too, where all the people, both good and bad, had gone. He was going through options in his mind when the door from the garage to the house was opened, letting in a slice of light that cut into the darkness surrounding the minivan. It was Jerry.
Guys, I hate to interrupt, but I think we've got company in one of the houses across the street.
Neil, still feeling exposed and a little defeated, asked,
Yeah, and your point is? I'm talking about people. You know, the live variety, and not the kind that wants to have all of us for dinner?
Feeling excited and even a little hopeful, Neil asked, What?
Yeah, I think Rachel saw someone across the street in one of the houses. And I think that they know that we are here too.
Chapter 46. Emma was back at the window again. She was sure that she saw movement at the corner of the drawn blinds in the house across the way. Maybe she was just being hopeful and seeing what she wanted to see, as Ivanov had suggested, but she didn't believe that for even an instant. She was wondering if there was a way to get their attention without getting the unwanted attention of those things down on the street between them. The ghouls, whose numbers had grown over the past several hours, had been gradually making their way down into the cul-de-sac. They were an impassable barrier, a sea that defied navigation. Emma knew that if there were people over there, then the barrier would have to be addressed. Until then, though, she just had to find definitive evidence that there were people there so that Doc Caldwell and the cop would believe her and help her in coming up with a solution. As it was, the good doctor and the cop had spent most of their time resting and eating and waiting. They felt as safe as they had since that early morning when they had escaped the hospital. But if there was anything that she had learned over the past few days, it was that safety was fleeting, and that it was dangerous to get comfortable and complacent. So she watched and waited and hoped for a sign from across the street. Chapter 47. Why does she gotta stand there like that? Does she want to get us caught? Maybe she's just trying to tease me in the dock with her ass. Slut. She knows exactly what she's doing. Acting like she can see something across the way. What kind of fool does she take me for? Why is it that she's the only one who seemed to be able to see signs of actual life in that house? Just wishful thinking. He knew better. He was prepared. His soul was prepared. The end of days isn't about surviving. It's about judgment and redemption. It was probably that sense of judgment that had restrained Officer Ivanov up until then. He had gone back and forth between wanting to strangle her and wanting to take her since they had started their flight. How many days ago was that? He'd lost count. As they settled cozier and cozier into the house, though, he was starting to feel that restraint was pointless. And he started to get the sense that she even wanted him to take her. The way that she swayed her hips and shook her hair was full of temptation, and she knew it. She was the sort who used her wiles to get her way. He'd come to that conclusion days ago. She was of low moral values and not deserving of respect. She probably didn't want respect. He was starting to think that maybe he should show her a lesson, and then maybe she would see the error of her ways. He looked over at the doctor, who was asleep. The doctor turned on the couch and let out a long, slow breath that came from deep down. It was a breath full of fear and doubt. The doc was probably thinking about her, too. It was probably going to be up to Mal to get things started. They'll both thank him afterward. He just knew that they would. The woman could sense some of what he was thinking. At least that was how he interpreted her impression when she looked away from the window back at him. In apparent frustration, she walked away from the window and went down the hall. Sensing his cue, Officer Ivanov stood up and very gingerly made his way down the hall after her. Yeah, she was going to appreciate this, and so was he. It had been a long time since he had last been with a woman. This time, though, it would be different. They hadn't been drinking. So there would be no doubts and no excuses for anyone. Chapter 48. Seeing his shadow come down the hall after her, Emma shook her head and said, "If you're coming down here to hassle me or to talk about God, then I have to admit that I don't have the energy to deal with you right now." Standing in the doorway, he didn't say a word to her. He walked through and shut the door behind him, startling her somewhat.
"What do you want, officer?"
"I think you know what I want, and it's the same thing that you want, so just drop the act, okay?"
"What the fuck are you talking about?"
"That mouth of yours. You're just trying to get me riled, aren't you? Well, honey, I'm already there." He walked across the room as she retreated toward the closet.
"I don't know what you had in mind, but I don't like the way you're talking to me."
"You know perfectly well what's on my mind." He was leaned forward on the balls of his feet, like a predator ready to pounce. He narrowed his eyes and turned his lips up into a snarl.
"You had just better back the fuck off."
"You say no, but I can see that you don't mean it. You're just like all women." Looking around for anything with which to defend herself, Emma saw nothing. She was in a child's bedroom that was full of safe, soft toys, pillows, and blankets. She backed slowly into the closet and nearly fell over a wooden rocking horse that had been pushed off to the side by its previous rider. He stepped closer as she regained her balance and took her eyes off of him. Desperate, she said,
"I said no, and I mean no. Now get the fuck away from me."
"Oh, sweetie, we're gonna have such fun. You'll see, and then you'll regret having made us both wait as long as you did." Tears of anger and fear started to spill from her eyes as she continued to back up. The clothes hanging in the closet welcomed her into their domain like the embracing limbs of a dense forest. She tried to get around him, but he was too close now. He was almost upon her. Her breathing was strained and frightened. His was deep and hungry. He grabbed her by the arm and forced her back farther into the closet. She fell backward, hitting her head on the back wall and sliding down to the floor. He tried to grab her blouse as she fell, but only came away with her name tag that was still on her chest. Lying there and still desperate for rescue, but too terrified to make any loud noises, she looked to both sides and then she laid her eyes on it. Leaning in the corner of the closet was an ancient Louisville Slugger miniature wooden baseball bat. It was the sort of thing that professional baseball teams would give away at season openers and for special events to the first 100 or 1,000 or however many people to come into the park. It was primarily a toy, but it was solid wood and just about the right size for the confined space in which she found herself. She reached out and grabbed the small bat with her left hand and swung almost in the same motion. The bat found its mark on the police officer's shin. He hopped up onto his other foot almost immediately as the pain registered. She didn't hesitate and swung the bat, trying to hit him in the crotch. She missed and hit him instead on his hip. It was enough, though, to force him back on his heels. She got to her feet as quickly as possible and came at him, not satisfied with merely defending herself. She wanted to hurt him as much as he wanted to hurt her. He reached to his hip for his pistol, but remembered that he'd taken off his belt in the living room before following her down the hall. Even his mace was missing. He gritted his teeth and held up his hand to try and calm her. She didn't wait even an instant. She hit him on his upheld hand and then on his arm. He recoiled with pain, but then wheeled around with both of his fists up. "You fucking bitch! We'll see who's gonna get who. Put that fucking bat down before I really decide to teach you a lesson." She swung the bat at him, solely with the intention of forcing him back just a little farther so she could get to the door. He hadn't locked it, so she opened it and backed herself through it, closing it as she did. He leapt forward and landed hard against the now closed door. He shouted, "You fucking slut! You're fucking dead!" Already hearing the commotion in his sleep, but unable to wake, the shouting was enough to draw Dr. Caldwell to consciousness. He was just waking and sitting up when Emma came running down the hall with a bat in her hand. "What is going on?"
"That fucking cop was trying to rape me."
"What?" he asked in disbelief. Looking down the hallway toward a very angry Officer Ivanov, who was just then coming through the bedroom door, Dr. Caldwell stood up and demanded, "What the hell is going on, Mal? That bitch invited me back to a bedroom with her, and when she changed her mind, she got all defensive and violent. She fucking hit me with a bat." "What?" But Emma didn't wait for the police officer to repeat his story. She leaned back and let the bat fly. The wooden projectile glanced off of the officer's back as he ducked, and then went through the front window. The smashing glass caused both Officer Ivanov and Dr. Caldwell to cringe. But Emma wasn't done. She looked down and saw the police belt on the reclining chair. She lifted up the holster and made her way around the doctor. Officer Ivanov backed away slowly and tried to calm her with, "Now, let's not be hasty. The broken window might draw those things' attention, but a gunshot definitely will."
"You piece of shit! You act like I should care!"
She threw down the belt and holster, having retrieved what she needed. Malachi Ivanov ducked his head down behind his hands and lowered himself into a protective crouch. Emma didn't wait for even a moment. She took aim and let loose with the mace she had taken from his belt. The stream of caustic vapor and liquid found its mark, finding the police officer's face, eyes, nose, and mouth. He fully expected to be shot, so when he was only maced, his relief mixed with the wholly unexpected kind of pain that he was experiencing. He fell backward, as if he had been shot, and screamed.
My eyes! My eyes! I can't see!"
He shouted some more profanities and fell to his knees as he rubbed and rubbed at his stinging, burning eyes.
"I'll fucking get you, you bitch!" "Yeah, you already tried once, and look where it got you. Go fuck yourself."
With both of them spent from the past few seconds of activity, there was a sudden quiet that settled over the room. The quiet, of course, was immediately overwhelmed with the sound coming from the street and yard below. Dr. Caldwell went to the now broken window and looked out.
"Damn it. We gotta get out of here, and fast. Can you guys put this behind you until we're clear of this place?" "Fuck him. Leave him here."
"Don't you dare listen to her, Doc. She's the one who caused all this. I'm a cop, for Christ's sake. Who you gonna believe, me or her?" Chapter 49. The shattering glass drew everyone's attention and shored up the opinion that there were people in the house across the street. It had quite obviously also had the same effect on the monsters in the street. It was as if they already suspected that there was fresh meat nearby and had just been waiting for their cue. As a single body, the 100 or so of the things began to congregate outside the house. Milling about in their tattered shreds of clothing and with their gray, rotting flesh, the ghouls filled the street. There was an animalistic excitement that swept through the undead bodies. Their tics, random but constant, smoothed considerably with their new focus, though their movement by and large had become much stiffer and more rigid. They were rotting, and their dexterity was starting to suffer. To Jerry, watching from a front window in the bunkered house across the street, this was the best news he'd learned in quite a while. Perhaps they could outlast these things. Maybe they would decompose to a state of immobility. There was hope. Perhaps. He watched and shook his head as the still unrevealed person or people in the house across the street made a foolish but predictable mistake. From the second-floor broken window came hurtling a broken bottle with a flower-like flame dancing from its top. The glass hit the pavement in front of the yard and amidst the large group of zombies. The resulting flash and fire engulfed close to a dozen of the things, who barely even reacted to the change. The fire went out soon enough, leaving the ghouls smoldering and reeking of burned flesh and hair. Neil had described their smell pretty well from his very close encounter with one of them, but Jerry hadn't been able to smell them himself. The new smell from the impromptu and half-assed attempt at a barbecue in the street was nauseating, even through the closed windows of their sanctuary. And then he chuckled when he saw yet another of the improvised Molotov cocktails tossed out. The second bottle didn't travel nearly as far and exploded with a much larger ball of flame and plume of black smoke. Quite obviously, the second of the bombs was a larger bottle filled with more of whatever flammable liquid had been found. The second blast caught the larger group's attention momentarily. All of the undead eyes seemed to turn themselves at this latest distraction. Chapter 50. "That's it?" asked Dr. Caldwell. To which the police officer answered, "Yeah, there's some other things down there that will burn, but nothing like what we've already thrown out." Nodding and biting his lower lip, Dr. Caldwell said soberly, "Well, I guess that's our cue to make our move then." Feeling the chills on her arms and up her spine again, Emma forced herself to nod and led the two men down the stairs to the back door. Hopefully, none of those things had made their way around to the back of the house yet. They'd find out soon enough, though. Emma and Dr. Caldwell removed the nails from the pieces of lumber nailed around the doorframe and on the floor in front of the door. When all had been prepared, the doctor looked at Officer Ivanov and asked him, "You ready?" "Yeah, I guess so." "Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3... The door flew open, and out jumped Dr. Caldwell. He hadn't planned on going first, but his adrenaline and all the sugar from the sweets they'd been eating over the past couple of days teamed up against him and substituted impatient bravado for his better judgment. He spun around, looking in every direction. So far, so good. He nodded to the other two and gestured with his hand in a manner to signify that all was clear. Emma and the police officer quickly followed the doctor out into the backyard and then ran over to the fence. "What if more of those things are over there in the backyards between here and there and we can't make it?" asked the police officer. More to Emma than to the peace officer, Dr. Caldwell responded, "By all accounts, we should probably be dead by now anyway. I guess we just deal with everything as it happens. No point in planning for what we could never predict." Remembering that everything beginning with the moment that he'd responded to the emergency distress call he'd received to quell a disturbance at Providence Hospital until right then defied reason and normalcy, the police officer just nodded in obvious agreement. The three of them helped one another over the 6-foot-high cedar fences and abandoned their latest refuge, wondering if that would be their last. Their intention was to traverse all of the backyards that sat between their house and the one that supposedly housed other survivors. It was a gamble, but they all had agreed that getting away from their house was going to be difficult, and so far so good. They were running along the cedar fence in what appeared to be a utility easement. The underbrush was thick and untouched. The going was slow and noisy, their feet crunching the stale and drying growth. Officer Ivanov, leading the other two, ran with his pistol drawn from its holster. He pushed aside smallish birch tree trunks here and there, sapling firs and wild raspberry bushes growing everywhere. He didn't look back to verify the other two kept up. It didn't matter to him. It was their job to keep up. He just needed to cut the path and show them the way. It wasn't like that summer years ago when he moved to Bethel to work with his Uncle Simeon. His uncle had his own guiding business. He'd take out groups to hunt moose, fish salmon, or photograph wildlife. They worked from before sunrise most days until almost sunset, keeping in mind that there was only a handful of hours and sometimes less separating the two daily events in the summers on the lower Kuskokwim River. He loved the nature of the work, loved being out on the river or trekking across the land. He knew how to hunt. It was in his blood. He got so excited on his first trip with a group of hunters from Kentucky that he brought down the first bear they encountered. He saw the animal from quite a distance, knelt against a tree, and fired. The gunshot startled everyone in the group, including his uncle. Later that night, Uncle Simeon took him aside and tried to explain that they were not there for themselves. They were there to help these other people who didn't know Alaska to experience what most Alaskans take for granted. It was their job to make sure that the visitors who came to them walked away at the end of the week thinking that they'd just had the trip of a lifetime. And for many of their visitors, it was exactly that. All summer, Uncle Simeon was correcting him. He walked too fast when they were in thick vegetation. It was hard for the hunters to keep up. He didn't talk enough and explain how and why they did things. He smoked too much and cursed more than he should. He didn't answer questions often, and when he did, he was too smug. All summer, Malachi tried to slow his pace, tried to answer questions, tried to impress his uncle, but at summer's end, he was told that he wouldn't be asked to return the next year. Uncle Simeon tried to give him a last bit of advice, but Malachi wasn't hearing any of it. He wanted his paycheck and his airline ticket to go back to Anchorage and back to civilization where things made more sense to him. He loved to hunt and fish, but he just couldn't hack the village lifestyle. And now here he was, cutting another path through the rough, but this time he didn't have to look back or be concerned that the paying hunters couldn't keep up. If that woman and the doctor couldn't keep pace with him, well, that was just their bad luck. Chapter 51.
Is this the house?
Emma asked quietly before they jumped the fence. Dr. Caldwell looked through the narrow gaps between the slats of treated cedar planks comprising the fence. He looked right and then left through the fence. Yeah, I think this is it. I don't see smoke coming from the chimney, though. Emma's eyes widened.
What?
Relax. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. Officer Ivanov muttered under his breath. This had better not been a wild goose chase. Emma looked over at him and was all ready to unleash a barrage of obscenity-laced accusations, but caught Dr. Caldwell's eyes and instead bit her tongue. She instead offered,
Well, getting in there has got to be better than waiting around out here, right? I mean, we've got to get inside somewhere. Those things will definitely find us out here.
She's right. Let's get over there and check it out. It looks like the yard is fenced on all four sides, so the likelihood that some of those things are in the backyard is pretty slim. Still, keep your eyes open. Malachi asked no one in particular. So who goes over first? Emma said as bluntly as she dared.
Well, I guess if you're asking, then we can assume that you don't want to go first, and I'm not staying over here with you by myself, so I guess I'll go.
Dr. Caldwell looked at the police officer and said, That's ridiculous. Quickly, she responded.
What, that the cop won't actually man up and protect us, or that I refuse to be alone with a rapist?
You fucking... Stop it, goddammit, both of you. Regardless of what went on, Emma, those comments aren't helping. Malachi, wounded by the possible suggestion, asked, What do you mean by what went on? This is neither the time nor the place. Emma, ending the stalemate, demanded, Give me a goddamn boost, Doc. You keep your fucking hands off. Fuck you.
Doc?
She crested the fence and stalled to look around from the top. The backyard was empty, and the gate was closed securely. She breathed a small sigh of relief for at least this bit of good news. When the back door leading from the house to the second-story deck opened, she almost wet herself. Standing in the doorway was a chubby blonde woman and young man holding a scoped hunting rifle. Emma looked back down at the two men and said with a smile,
There are people. They're on the deck and waving at me as I speak.
Chapter 52.
How many are there?
Jerry answered immediately, his voice filled with excitement.
I don't know. So far there's just a woman, but I'm guessing there's at least one more. Why do you say that?
I don't think she got herself over the fence on her own. She just doesn't seem the type. Neil felt something that he hadn't in some time. He felt hopeful. Maybe this wasn't the end of the world. Maybe this was just a reality check for all of them who had started to take for granted all that they had. Maybe this was just the cold slap in the face that humanity needed to get its shit together. What's she doing? He asked Jerry and Rachel.
She's in the yard. What is she? Oh, she's getting the ladder. There must be others there.
Good. Does she need any help? Jerry, while excited about their new and welcome company, continued to look around at the yards and the woods surrounding them.
No, I think she's got it. The ladder is already over the fence. I see 2 more people coming over. One is a cop.
Any more?
No, that looks like that's about it.
Chapter 53. Emma ran over to the deck while Dr. Caldwell and Ivanov were still getting over. The first thing she noticed about the deck was that the bottom half of the stairs were gone. They'd been removed and tossed to the ground. The blonde woman who had been standing at the door came over to the edge and offered a hand down to Emma.
"Come on up. Quick, before those things know that you're out here."
The blonde woman's jacket, a shiny black faux leather jacket, caught on first a railing edge and then on a long nail, probably used to hang a planter or a bird feeder that was sticking out from the railing. Frustrated, the woman removed her jacket and tossed it up onto a lawn chair that was sitting on the top of the deck. Hand fully extended, she said,
"Here, take my hand."
Emma gripped the warm, soft hand, and using her other on the lowest wooden step, which sat at about eye level, lifted herself up out of the yard. And with all the urgency they could muster, the doctor and the police officer got themselves up as well. The man, boy, really, standing at the doorway and still holding the hunting rifle, suggested,
"Let's all get inside. We can introduce ourselves in there."
Emma, tears in her eyes, nodded and smiled, walking past the young man and into the house. Chapter 54. Neil began. "So, do you have any news? Where did you guys come from? How did you get here? Are there others that you know of?" Dr. Caldwell held up both of his hands to stall the barrage of questions. He shook his head and answered at the same time. "We've been on the run for days now. How long has it been? We haven't heard from or seen anyone since we fled the hospital. We were kind of hoping that maybe you had answers to those same questions. I guess we're all as blind as one another." Megan related to them what they had heard on the radio and television before the power and then the signals had died. She told them about a possible defense line established at Kinnick Arm Bridge, but that they didn't know if it had worked or not. She described the chaotic nature of the news reports and how no one seemed to know what was happening. She likened the character of the broadcasts to those of the morning of September 11th, 2001, when the World Trade Center had been brought down by a terrorist attack. There was a lot of talking, but not a lot being said. There was fear and doubt in the voices from the news reporters, and a lot of speculation. And then there was just silence after the power went out. They didn't know what had happened or what was going to happen. She told them about getting away from Midtown Anchorage and finding their way to the house in which they had found refuge. She talked and talked about what they had seen and what they had done. She began to cry when she spoke about hiding in the house and not going out to help those who were being hunted and trapped on the roads outside. The doctor stopped her. "You shouldn't be ashamed. There really probably wasn't anything you or anyone else could have done anyway. We were in the hospital where all of this began." He stopped suddenly when he realized that he recognized Jerry from the hospital. He couldn't believe his eyes. "Jerry?"
"Yes, Dr. Caldwell."
"You made it out?"
"Yeah."
"And those kids?"
"Yeah, they're here too."
Jules and Danny appeared from behind Kim. Dr. Caldwell took a long look at the two children and then smiled at Jerry. "Well done, Jerry." That was all he said, but Jerry could read the rest of what he meant in the doctor's expression. Neil asked, "What about you, Doctor? How did you make it here?" The doctor looked at Emma and then at Officer Ivanov. "Can we sit down and maybe get something to drink?" For a moment, everyone felt normal again. The three newcomers were treated like guests in a home. They were shown to the dining room table and given some cups with water taken from a large bucket in the sink. They were also each given a granola bar and a small package of fruit snacks. Swallowing a bite of granola that was almost half of the entire snack bar, Dr. Caldwell began. "We were there, Jerry, the kids, and I, when it all started. There was a child who was brought to the hospital by his parents. He'd been bitten by something. It was assumed that it was some kind of wild animal, but these two kids insisted that it was a caveman, I believe is what they called it. Regardless, the boy worsened by the second, and then he just died. We tried to revive him, but there was nothing we could do for him. His little body was just too weak, too fragile. He looked over at the two children, who were still standing in the living room, just steps away from him, and apologized. We tried and tried, but we just couldn't do anything for him. Your brother died. I'm sorry. A bit confused, but wanting to know, Jules asked in her timid little voice, "What about my mommy and daddy?" The doctor shook his head, and his eyes, watery and sad, he said, "I don't think they made it either." To the others he continued, "That's where it all started, like I said. Everything happened so quickly and so tragically. As one was getting knocked down, another was getting up. Things got out of control right away. There was nothing anyone could do to stop any of it. It all just happened so quickly." He told them of their retreat through the hospital and how their group was steadily whittled away. He told them about Simon at the hospital and how he had helped them, only to fall victim to the fiends himself. When he spoke about the helicopter and their escape from the hospital, he heard his two companions finally exhale. They'd been holding their breaths while he spoke. They were reliving their flight and their fear in their own minds as he spoke. They couldn't help it. While it was happening, it had all gone by in such a blur of violence and death. This had been the first time that any of them had talked about it, the first time that any of them had reflected on it out loud. And so now here we are, Tony said somberly. Amen. Dr. Caldwell looked up at him and nodded. Amen indeed. Chapter 55. It was a handful of hours later. The newcomers, Emma and Dr. Caldwell anyway, had changed into new clothes. Emma had forgotten what it was like to wear comfortable shoes as she slipped on the sneakers taken from a woman's closet. It was necessary for all of them to wear shoes and sweatshirts and whatever else they could find to stay warm. Despite the fire still burning in the fireplace, it was getting cooler and cooler in the house, and their woodpile was getting smaller and smaller. They couldn't continue to burn wood indefinitely. Rachel walked from room to room looking for something. Finally, Jules, after having watched her frantically searching, asked her, "What you looking for?" "My coat. I'm looking for my coat. You remember what it looked like?" "Yeah, it was a cool, shiny black one. It was pretty." Rachel smiled and touched the child's head. "Yeah, it is a cool jacket, isn't it? My mom gave that to me for my birthday." "Your birthday? When did you have that?" "About 2 weeks ago." "Did you go to Chuck E. Cheese?" Smiling and laughing a little, Rachel answered, "No, I guess I missed out, huh?" "Yeah, they got the best pizza, and have you ever played skeet ball?" "Yeah, I think I have." "That's the best, and then you get tickets, and you can go get cool stuff at the shop. Last time we went, I didn't have enough tickets to get the purse and makeup that I wanted, so Marty gave me some of his tickets. Danny did too. I still have the purse, but I used up all the makeup." "Did you have fun?" "Uh-huh. But it wasn't my birthday then. We just went because we'd all been good, and Mom said that if we were good and quiet on Saturday, then we could go on Sunday as a treat." "I guess you were good then." "Yeah. If you didn't go to Chuck E. Cheese, then where did you go?" "My mom took me out to dinner at a place called Glacier Brew House. We had a really nice dinner, and we talked and talked. It's nice just to sit and talk with your mom sometimes." Feeling herself start to get emotional, Rachel turned away and said, "Well, my mom gave me the jacket that night. She knew that I wanted it, but knew that I'd never buy it for myself. She just wanted me to have it. I'll help you find it." "Thanks, kid. Jules, I mean." "You're welcome. My mom always asks me, 'Where do you remember seeing it last?'" Crying now, Rachel said, "Mine too, Jules, mine too." They looked upstairs and down, but could not locate it. They even looked out in the garage, despite the fact that Rachel couldn't remember the last time that she'd even been in there. Someone may have moved it and set it in there by mistake. They looked and looked, but in the end came up empty-handed. It was early afternoon by then, and things had started to settle down. Most of the activity in the house was happening, not surprisingly, around the fire. There wasn't anything specific that was happening, really. They were just hanging out and waiting, activities that had become the mainstay of their day-to-day lives. Emma wasn't in the room. She was down the hall in one of the bedrooms. She was still angry and hurt by what had happened between her and Officer Ivanov. She couldn't be in the same room with him anymore. She was frankly concerned that she wouldn't be able to control herself around him anymore and fly off in a rage that might just leave him dead. She was carrying one of the pistols that Neil had scavenged from Fred Meyer. It was a smallish silver revolver that smelled of oil and was somewhat heavy in her hand. Deep down, she hoped that he'd try it again, and she could stop him permanently. As it was, she just avoided being around him. She figured that was just the safest thing for all of them because she knew that a gunshot would certainly give their sanctuary away. She wouldn't, however, hesitate to use the gun, regardless of consequences, if he ever came at her like that again. For his part, Officer Ivanov was downstairs alone in the darkness of the boarded-up family room, staring at the blank television screen. He was remembering past football games that he'd watched on his own television. He missed his ritual. Living in Alaska, he'd grown accustomed to the fact that NFL games started early in the morning. The hassle of having to wake early on Sunday mornings to catch the games, especially Seattle Seahawks games, wore off after a very short time. Sitting down in the dimly lit basement family room, he was suddenly startled to see his youthful cousin sitting comfortably, with his feet up on the couch. His boyish frame and smiling face appeared exceptionally comfortable on the small couch. His father was there too, standing in the doorway with a bag of his favorite chips, Lay's barbecue. The Seahawks had the ball and were all set to snap. The three of them held their breath while they watched Hasselbeck scramble behind his defensive line. He couldn't seem to be able to find a target, and then he saw him. A streaking receiver running along the sideline. He arched back and tossed the ball, a perfect spiral, into the air. Malachi could feel his heart begin to race. Would he catch that pass? It seemed like such a long shot. If he did, though, it was smooth sailing all the way to the end zone. He looked over at his cousin. He was chewing feverishly on his snack of choice, Slim Jim beef sticks. He returned Malachi's stare and smiled. When he looked back, the television wasn't on anymore. He was back in the dark room. His father was gone, as was his cousin. Malachi was alone again. He stood up from the recliner and moved to the small couch. He touched where his cousin had been sitting and felt around for any evidence that he or anyone had been there. The fabric was cold, and the empty wrappers from the beef sticks weren't there anymore either. He massaged his sweaty forehead and temples, trying to will away the doubt and confusion. They had been here with him. But how? And where were they now? He sat down on the couch and about screamed when he looked over and saw his father sitting in the lazy-boy recliner. "What's wrong, Mal?" "Daddy?" "Yeah, buddy, I'm here. What's wrong?" But how? Where... Aren't you?" "Just like you, Mal. Can't put together a single thought and get it out of your mouth. Nothing's changed, has it?" With his eyes as wide as his mouth, Malachi looked around. The game was gone from the television and his cousin was still absent, but his father was definitely there. "How long have you been here, Daddy?" "What do you mean by that, little man?" "You know I don't like it when you call me that." "Father's right, I guess." "Why are you here?" His father, still watching the blank television screen, asked. "Why are you?" "What do you mean? We had to come here or else we would have been..." "Would have been what? Have you been a bad boy again?" "No, Daddy, we just... You and your friends haven't been setting fires again, have you?" "No, Daddy, I've been a good boy." "You'd better. Remember what happened to your cousin at the school?" "Yes, Daddy, I remember. I haven't been playing with matches. I learned my lesson. You don't have to—" There was a long pause, during which Malachi looked around the room again. When he looked back at the recliner, his father was gone. Malachi's childhood uncertainty, long forgotten and set aside, was still there, though. The soreness of bruises from decades ago returned to his arms and shoulders. He could almost feel the knuckle indentations on his skin. He heard a voice again, but couldn't make it out clearly. He heard it again. He looked around, trying to figure out from where it was coming. He couldn't make out the words, let alone their source. He held his breath and concentrated. "Officer? Officer? Are you hungry?" He opened his clenched eyes and saw a big Asian guy standing in the doorway now. It took a second more before he recognized the man as Tony from upstairs. He looked at the man for a good long while. He bit his lower lip, chewing on the raw, chapped skin there. Tony waited a moment longer and then entered the seemingly subterranean room. It felt like a dungeon down there. The meager light coming in around the edges of the plywood covering the outside of the window barely provided any illumination at all. He was afraid that he might be disturbing or even waking the man. Though he couldn't see him well, Tony could sense a degree of uncertainty in the other man's body language. He stalled a second or two longer, hoping that the other man would speak up or at least acknowledge his presence in the room. "Are you okay?" Officer Ivanov finally leaned back and said, "I'm good." "You hungry?" "No, I'm good. If I get hungry, I'll come up." "Do you want some company down here?" Shaking his head, "No, I'm good." "Okay, you need anything, just holler." At that, Tony went back upstairs. He found Dr. Caldwell sitting in the kitchen with Emma, Neil, and Megan. Tony leaned into the wall and waited for the discussion to come to a pause, at which point he could interrupt. They were talking about what they had seen and where. The doctor was describing the numerous police barricades they'd seen while they flew over them in the helicopter. Neil had an Anchorage City street map on the table and was moving it around to mark the locations of each of these failed barricades. They were trying to plot probable escape routes and identify alternate routes around possible roadblocks and problem spots. Finally, Tony couldn't wait anymore. He looked over his shoulder to make sure that he was only talking with the 4 people at the table. "Guys, I don't know if that cop downstairs is doing all right." A knowing smile spread across Emma's face, and she said acidly, "That guy only wears a cop uniform. He's nowhere near being an actual cop. No cops I've ever known would or even could do the things that he's done." Dr. Caldwell understood Emma's comment, but everyone else's faces were questioning. Emma was about to clarify for all of them when she caught the doctor's eyes and thought better of it. She accepted the fact that there would be a more appropriate place for Malachi to have to answer for what he tried to do to her, and for his cowardly behavior. She didn't like it, but she did trust Dr. Caldwell's judgment. Dr. Caldwell looked at Tony and asked for him to elaborate. "Well, I was down there with him for a few seconds, but I don't think he knew that I was there. He was looking right at me, but he just didn't know. And then when he did realize that someone was in the room with him, I don't think that he knew that it was me. I mean, I've seen some blank stares in my time and even some nasty glares, but he was totally absent." Caldwell asked, "What was he doing?" "Nothing. Just sitting there watching a blank TV screen." "Did he threaten you or appear to be a danger to himself?" "No. He just didn't seem right to me." "It's probably just exhaustion. Give him some room, and if he wants to stay down there by himself, well, we'll just have to accommodate him on that one. Let's all keep an eye on him, though." Emma added, "Yeah, we don't need a Columbine or Virginia Tech on our hands." With that comment, Neil was suddenly concerned about the presence of the newcomers. He could tell that there was something more going on, especially with Emma, but he wasn't sure what it was. He needed to know because they couldn't afford any surprises. There just wasn't any room for problems in their little sanctuary. Forgetting about his unease when he was downstairs, Tony began to munch on a can of Hormel chili that had been cooked in the fire. He asked, "So what's going on?" Neil started to explain that they were just trying to prepare for contingencies when he was interrupted by a quiet but clearly audible electronic tone that repeated and repeated and repeated. It was a cell phone. It was Rachel's cell phone. She realized it almost immediately. Her phone was in her jacket, and her jacket was outside. She now remembered that she'd taken it off to help Emma, the police officer, and the doctor while they were trying to climb up onto the deck. It was still sitting out back on the side railing of the deck. It was outside, ringing and ringing. Rachel, who was sitting in the living room hanging out with Jules, leapt to her feet and ran to the back door. She saw her jacket and flew outside to retrieve it. She fumbled with the pockets until she found the phone and powered it off. Neil looked at her with both hope and terror in his eyes. She shook her head and said apologetically, "It was just my alarm. It's time for my annual doctor's appointment. I turned the phone on earlier to see if we'd gotten a cell signal yet, and I guess I forgot to turn it off. Sorry." Jerry, who had positioned himself at the front window, said, Guys, they know that we're here now. Come take a peek." Outside in the street, the crowd of zombies who had been just gathering and waiting all began to turn and walk over to the house. Their movements, which had become slow and stiff, became more organic. Their steps picked up pace as the excitement grew in the crowd. They had been detecting odors of the living for some time, but hadn't been able to pinpoint the source. The noise was all that it took. There were probably more than 100 of them in the street by then. They gathered around the front of the house and began to pound the siding with their fists, their feet, and even their heads. A few made their way up the short flight of steps leading up to the porch and started to bang on the front door. Neil's fear suddenly gripped him again. They didn't have much of a choice any longer. They were going to have to go outside and face these things. Their refuge had been compromised, and it was just a matter of time before it would be breached. He felt that familiar chill on his arms, his legs, and up his spine. He also felt a sense of despair start to nag at him. He had begun to believe that they might all make it out alive. But that feeling all at once faded. He knew that they were in trouble. Rachel could tell that she had just let the air out of everyone's balloon. She was crying and begging for forgiveness. Kim left the front window, having seen enough already, and went over to Rachel, who was sitting on the floor. Rachel's long, permed blonde hair was covering her face as she slumped forward. Her tears, obscured by the blonde curtain, coursed down her splotchy red cheeks and dampened her too-tight scavenged sweater. Kim tried to console her by rubbing her hunched shoulders and speaking kind words, but she knew it was all for naught. Under her breath, Rachel sobbed to herself, "I've doomed us all." Kim wanted to tell her that it was just an accident and that all hope wasn't lost, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Those words may have been the right things to say, but the words simply wouldn't come. Kim wanted to tell her that she was wrong. She really wanted to believe that Rachel was wrong, but the persistent silence that had reigned the streets for so many days refused to hear any of it. Kim's doubt quieted her comfort to both Rachel and herself. She was understandably concerned that Rachel was painfully correct in her assessment. Of course, Kim didn't want to believe that, but Rachel's words flashed bright and undeniable. The pounding on the walls and doors was bad enough, but it didn't appear to be all that they could expect. With the ghouls closer, a cloud of rot-filled air seemed to settle over the house, finding its way in through any seam or opening that presented itself. It was an odor that clung to clothing, carpet, and hair. There was no suppressing it with candles or air freshener. Kim tried. Jerry threw more wood onto the fire, hoping that the warm air rising up the chimney would prevent some of the foul stench from trickling down. Nothing they did seemed to make any difference at all. After trying to deal with it for quite some time and nothing working, They all seemed to accept the fact that the reek was there to stay, and the only way to get away from it was to get away from the house. Neil remembered a segment from a history book in a college class from years ago. It was an entry about the American Civil War and, more specifically, the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, or was it Antietam? He couldn't remember for sure. What he did recall about the passage was the description of the battlefield. It was so vivid to him. The writer described a scene with bodies still strewn across farm fields several days after the battle's end, on roads and footpaths, near streams, and amidst trees. The writer wrote about the pungence that seemed to permeate the very air being breathed, of the sense that the air itself was poison. He thought about that passage as he struggled to breathe shallowly, trying not to inhale any more of the reeking foulness than he absolutely must in order to survive. He felt himself stifle the urge from his churning, revolting stomach to vomit several times early on during that day. Dr. Caldwell offered a temporary and less than ideal solution. He took a bandana from a drawer in a child's bedroom, soaked it with perfume, and then tied it over his mouth and nose. It wasn't perfect, but it made it so that he could keep working without having to fight the rising nausea every few moments. The others followed his lead, using any cloth they could find to become a makeshift surgical mask. To observe them was like watching a ragtag and under-equipped aid group dealing with a plague in a third-world nation. They were all sweaty and filthy, and their masks were rapidly becoming dingy. Jerry, Megan, Kim, and Dr. Caldwell were all rolling blankets into tight bundles in preparation for making a run for a new refuge. Neil and Tony were downstairs in the garage loading supplies into and onto the van. The stark reality of their situation was clearly evident to all of them, though. They only had a minivan, which typically could seat 7 safely, in which to transport 9 adults and 2 children. Neil thought they could pile supplies onto the top of the minivan, despite the fact that there wasn't a cargo rack on the vehicle. He felt that they could position items on the top and then tie them down so that they could mutually support staying in place. He didn't know if it would work or not, but he was willing to try, and Tony was more than willing to help. Of course, while they worked, a legion of undead pounded themselves against the closed garage doors. Their persistent and mind-numbing moaning was all the more loud in the garage than it was in the much more insulated house. The constant sound solicited a nausea that was not unlike motion sickness. "Could it get any worse?" asked Tony to no one in particular. Neil looked at him sardonically and said, "One thing I've learned lately is to not ask that question, because, yeah, I know, sorry. Let's just get this all taken care of and then figure out what our next step is." "You got it, boss. Do you really think that we can get away from here?" Neil had his doubts. They all did. He had to believe that it was possible, though. If he couldn't believe that, then why was he down in the garage loading up the van? Back upstairs, all of them were in the living room trying to decide the answers to Neil's questions. Officer Ivanov had to join them again, though he sat on the floor at the top of the stairs away from the larger group. He was sharing the same room, but the distance separating him from the others was still all but insurmountable. Rachel asked, "Why don't we just sit in here and shoot all of them down from safety?" Kim joined in. "Yeah, maybe if we kill enough of them, the others will get the point that we're not on the menu. I mean, any reasonable—" Jerry jumped on that comment. "Reasonable? Don't kid yourself. Don't any of you make that mistake. These things don't have the faculties for reason anymore. Come here." He led Kim to the window and directed her eyes. "There, that one. Look at it. Do you see it? The one that used to be a bald guy? Looks like he might be wearing a butcher's apron. How fitting. Do you see the one I'm talking about?" "Yeah." "Look at his eyes. I mean, really look at them. Do you see any inkling of reason left there? Look. Try to see any semblance of humanity." To everyone else, he continued, "These aren't people anymore. They're just barely animals. At least you can scare an animal off if you do the right things. These things don't scare. They don't reason.
weigh their options. More importantly, they won't hesitate and they won't show you any pity. If you see one of those things that looks like someone you might have known, don't expect it to show you any mercy. I'm only saying that to remind everyone how bad it can get if we're not all on the same sheet of music. We've been relatively safe and very lucky so far. Don't let that get any of us complacent.
Answering Rachel's original question, Neil said, "We don't have enough bullets to shoot all of those things, and anyway, with each shot we'll probably attract more of them." Megan asked him,
"What are you thinking, Neil?"
Remembering that hesitation kills, Neil jumped right into the obvious. "We can get all of us in the car and haul ass out of here. Getting started is going to be the hardest part of it. Once we get going, though, if we don't slow down at all, I think we can get away from the crowds. The only question is, which direction? I think it's safe to assume that both highways out of town will be jammed with stalled vehicles, so the car is only going to get us so far." Tony suggested, "Why don't we just get away from these things here and find ourselves another hiding spot somewhere else?" Dr. Caldwell asked, "And then what?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, after we find another hiding spot, how long do we stay there? We only have so much food and water. We can't wait indefinitely." Kim asked, "What if we find another supply stash somewhere, another store with some more food? Maybe we can find enough to... never mind." Neil rubbed his chin and thought. That wasn't a half-bad idea. They could just get away from this crowd, avoid being seen by the others, and then find a spot to hide away for a bit. If they chose the right spot in the right part of town, they could get close enough to a Fred Meyer or Cars to go scavenging for supplies. Maybe they could see if there was a way to wait this all out. That was a big list of maybes. Perhaps the biggest list of maybes since Thomas Jefferson last walked through one of his busy cotton fields. Perhaps even a bigger list of maybes than when Neil went shopping for condoms for the first time before what was to be a very promising weekend. It wasn't. With maybes, though, there were options, and with options there was the scant possibility of hope. Those thoughts ran through his head as a smile, the first in several days, spread slowly and tentatively across his face. "Kim, that's not a half-bad idea. Let's talk about that for a bit. We can take it a little bit at a time. No need to be in a rush. Let's figure it all out, and believe me, there's going to be a lot to figure out before we hightail it out of here. I think the first thing we should get settled is where. Where do we head?" Chapter 56. They talked and talked. Everyone more or less agreed that they should start heading north. There were more avenues of escape in that direction, more options. Neil was really starting to appreciate options. While they discussed it, Neil, Jerry, and Dr. Caldwell started piling firewood from the garage against the front door to try and shore it up a little. The physics of the porch out front made it all but impossible to have more than a couple of those things exerting pressure against the door, but they all decided that it was better to be safe than sorry. The added weight from the piled firewood helped to add a little security. More of the ghouls had come to help with the siege, and still more were on the way. A few remained in the street, but the vast majority of them were pressed against the front three walls of the house, pounding against them with their fists, their heads, and their bodies. With all the pressure, Neil and the others were starting to get worried about the window downstairs. They'd covered it over with a large sheet of plywood, and then covered the inside with a tarp, but it just didn't seem enough to any of them anymore. And it wasn't. On the second day of packing and planning, the window, which was behind the plywood, shattered. It was still in its frame, but the glass was as webbed as an arachnid's home. With no other options to cover the potential weak spot, Neil and Dr. Caldwell elected to remove a bedroom door from its hinges and hang it across the inside of the window. The doctor said as they worked, "You know that if they get through the plywood outside that this door isn't going to hold them at bay for very long, don't you?" "Hopefully we won't be here long enough to test that limit." "Yeah, hopefully." Sitting in the same room while they worked, but never getting up from his roost on the small couch, Officer Ivanov didn't participate in the conversation and seldom took his eyes from the blank television screen. He would alternate between reclining back on the worn cushions of the seat and leaning forward with both of his hands on his knees. Several times, Neil and Doc Caldwell looked at one another when the man changed his position. The police officer was a problem all his own. Neil had heard the story about what happened between Emma and him. Dr. Caldwell had related it as candidly and dispassionately as he was able. Neil wasn't quite sure what to think or how to treat the situation. Officer Ivanov wasn't making it easy either. His behavior had all of them on edge. In fact, most of the people in the house, including those who weren't privy to the details of the goings-on in the other house, just kept their distance from him. Neil knew that they weren't going to be able to avoid Malachi for long, but for the time being it seemed to be the best thing to do. If Malachi was having a psychotic episode, though, the pistol on his hip made both Dr. Caldwell and Neil very nervous. Chapter 57.
I think we're ready.
Neil looked at Emma and then at Megan, who had just spoken. He, of course, had been dreading this moment. Secretly, deep down, he guessed he'd been hoping that things would have changed before then so that they wouldn't have to go outside and confront the horrors that awaited them. He could only hope that he would rise up to the challenge. He knew that if he did, it would happen without his thinking about it. If he had to think about it, then there was little to no chance that he would be able to act. Just imagining going outside had kept sleep at bay a number of times since he and Tony had ventured down the street. Even Megan, sleeping next to him, hadn't allayed his fears much. While they worked, it was easy for him to stay occupied and avoid thinking about the possibility. But as the work was eventually wrapping up, it became increasingly difficult to find distractions. And now, with Megan's statement, there would be no more denying the reality of their situation. They were soon going to be on their way. Tony asked, "Has anyone thought about how we are going to get out?" All eyes turned to Dr. Caldwell and Neil. Neither of them had even begun to think about that. They'd been busy plotting a route away from their sanctuary, trying to avoid the main streets and the most likely spots of high vehicle congestion. They'd considered what of the dwindling supplies to load into the vehicle and where to sit people to maximize their limited space. They'd thought about all of that, but hadn't given much thought to their very first step. Kim suggested again,
Maybe we could just shoot a bunch of them and make it so that we can get out while they regroup.
Neil, doubting the effect of that ploy, said nonetheless,
Yeah, maybe.
Kim, like a dejected child, said,
Well, it was just an idea.
Sensing her disappointment, Neil followed up with,
Kim, it isn't a horrible idea. I just don't know if it will work.
Have you ever seen any war movies about the Revolution or the Civil War or anything?
I guess so. Why?
Well, I'm afraid that what will likely happen, just like with those lines of soldiers from those movies, that as one of the things is shot down from the front rank, another of them will move forward and fill his space. There may be no way to shoot enough of them fast enough to make an opening.
Okay, I see your point.
Dr. Caldwell interjected. What we need is a distraction. From the window, Tony said in a matter-of-fact manner, I've done my part with distractions. No more going out there to start another fire.
Maybe we could just forget about the car and make our way out on foot, Emma suggested. Go out the back and sneak away.
Rachel said dryly.
And how far do you think we'll get before they smell us out? And then where will we be, huh? On foot and out in the open? My fat ass, sorry kids, can't move that quick, and what about the kids? How long can they keep up?
Emma shot back.
Well, what's your idea? We've got to be able to open the garage door and get out. We can't do that with those things standing out there, unless you're planning on opening the door for the rest of us. Not likely. That's what I thought. If we can't get the door open, then we've got to think of other options, right?
Danny, sitting on the fringes of the group and watching Neil, got an idea. He got up and ran downstairs to the bookcase in the hallway. He remembered seeing some keys there and thought that they might be Megan's. He found the keys on the top of the low bookcase and, peeking in at Officer Ivanov as he darted by, ran upstairs with the keys jingling and jangling as he went. Neil asked, "What you got there, Danny? Keys?" Megan, recognizing the Hawaii keychain her fiancé had gotten for her from a trip down to the island Paradise a number of years back, said, "Those are mine." "Yeah, does this alarm thingy work?" "Well, yeah. Why? You afraid someone is going to try and steal my car?" "No, but—" Neil saw where Danny was headed and finished his thought for him. "But you can set off the alarm with your panic button, can't you?" "Yeah," Megan said, realizing the possibility too. Neil began. "Well, we can hit that button and see if it draws those things away. Then we can get that door open and get the hell out of Dodge." Neil looked over at Danny and gave him a thumbs-up sign. "Good job, Danny. You may have just come up with the opening that we needed." Danny smiled and felt more a part of the group, finally. He'd contributed and maybe saved all of their lives. And more importantly, he'd impressed Neil. Regardless of the situation, Danny felt like Neil and Jerry were the two coolest adults he'd ever met. They were smart and nice and listened to what he had to say. And the cool thing about that, to him, was that he wasn't a son, a nephew, or any other relation to these guys other than just a kid that got hooked up with them under some pretty bad circumstances. They didn't have to show him any attention or any respect, and yet both did. He was glad that, if he had to be trapped with anyone, at least he was spending his time with these two guys. The others weren't bad either, although that cop really kind of freaked him out a little. When he went downstairs to get Megan's keys, that cop was just sitting there. It looked like he was watching TV, but that couldn't be possible. Danny wasn't even quite sure that the cop noticed him when he looked in at him, even though he'd stood in the doorway plain as day. That guy just gave him the creeps. The others were all right, he guessed. They weren't mean to him or to Jules, but they treated both of them the way most adults treated them. He'd heard the phrase, "Children should be seen and not heard," before, and he felt like most of the people in the house lived by that standard. At least they had since he'd been around them. Neil and Jerry, though, were different. They were good guys, and he knew that he could trust them to look out for him and Jules. In movies and in games, for the most part, kids didn't die, and he thought that if anyone could help that to become a reality, it was Neil and Jerry. Neil took the keys from Danny and gave them to Megan. "Will the alarm still work with the car problems you've been having?" "Yeah. The alarm was never the problem. It was always the engine, the fuel pump to be exact. What are you thinking then?" Chapter 58. It was decided that Tony would open the garage door. He was the strongest and most fit person in the group, and therefore stood the best chance of getting the door up quickly and getting himself into the van. Kim wasn't too thrilled with the idea, but even she conceded that he was the most likely choice. Dr. Caldwell offered to help in getting the door up, but having to get a second person into the car and then get moving quickly just didn't seem to make much sense to any of them. Everyone except Neil, Dr. Caldwell, and Tony loaded themselves into the vehicle. Neil took a moment to take Lucky the dog into the backyard and drop him over the fence. It wasn't ideal, but they all felt like the dog would have a better chance than being left in the house or in the backyard with no food or water. Jules wasn't happy about the arrangement, but they all agreed that it wasn't practical to take the dog with them. After caring for the dog as best as Neil was able, he joined Jerry in the living room. It took both Jerry and Neil to coax Officer Ivanov out of his room downstairs and into the van. When they entered the television room, he looked at them with confusion in his eyes at first. Neil was convinced that the man either wasn't hearing or didn't understand him when he first began to speak. Finally, after explaining the plan and the need to get going right away, the police officer stood up and walked out to the garage. When he saw all the people in the van, he turned around and started to walk back inside. He didn't say a word to anyone. Jerry, who was coming back downstairs after a final walk-through of the living room and the upstairs bedrooms, caught sight of him going back into the downstairs room again.
Officer, officer, hey, Mal, where are you going?
I don't think I'm supposed to be here.
That's why we're leaving. None of us are supposed to be here. This is all just a mistake of colossal proportions. We need to get going right away, though. Do you think you can get yourself into the van so we can get to it?
The van?
Yeah, the one out in the garage. We need you to sit on the middle bench seat and be ready to close the door after Tony gets in from opening the garage door.
Tony?
Yeah, you know, Tony, the big guy.
He's going to hell, you know.
What?
Sodomites. They're all going to hell.
Well, I don't know anything about that.
I do. They're all to be damned.
Mal, can we worry about that later? Right now, Tony is going to help all of us get out of here, and for that, I think we can all cut him a little bit of a break. Don't you?
The police officer shuffled back out toward the garage, mumbling unintelligibly for the most part. He sat himself down in his assigned seat and didn't say a word to or look at anyone around him. Jerry climbed into the small space set aside for him in the back seat next to Emma and Kim, who each had a child in her lap. Rachel was supposed to be sitting on the bench between Megan and Officer Ivanov, but was presently standing/stooping partially between the two front seats, appearing to be anxious, worried, and unable to sit. Neil, Dr. Caldwell, and Tony were all standing in the upstairs window, looking down at the yard and street below them. It was amazing to think and remember that those things that were even then hungering for their flesh were once ordinary human beings. The vibrations in the air from their constant moaning had continued to rise in amplitude. Tony said to the others, "It's a good thing that we're leaving. I don't know how much longer I can take that sound." "Or the smell," Dr. Caldwell added, "and I'm a doctor, but the aroma of rotten flesh is downright overpowering for even me. I can only imagine what it's like for everyone else." Neil jumped in. "Hopefully we won't have to deal with much more of either. If we can get ahead of those things and just keep them behind us, we might just be okay. It's not the sound or the smell that bothers me most. It's their teeth that worry me. We ready?" The other two nodded and stepped away from the window. Neil lingered just a second longer. He hoped they were making the right decision, afraid that there would be no recovering from it if this was a mistake. And if it were a mistake, the error would be fatal for all of them. He swallowed hard and closed his eyes. He wasn't much for praying. He wasn't even much for believing in that sort of thing. But he found himself wondering more at that moment than he had in decades. And then he wondered about those ghouls outside. If there was a higher power of some sort, had their souls ascended? Or were they trapped? Trapped? He remembered a scene from the movie The Exorcist, in which the little possessed girl's mother showed the attending priest her daughter's stomach. At first there was nothing, but slowly and with the appropriate accompanying music, the words, "Help me," appeared on her skin from the inside out. That scene had always tugged at the terror strings in his own belly. She was still in there, and the demon was tormenting her. She was still in there, but had no control whatsoever of her body or her faculties. She was still in there. He wondered for just a heartbeat if those poor souls out on the front lawn were still in their battered and decomposing bodies. Was it a form of purgatory or damnation? He couldn't even begin to imagine, and hoped that he would never have to find out for himself. Realizing he was alone now, he took one last look around. The fire was still burning in the fireplace, warming a room that was carpeted with colorful pillows and blankets scattered all over the floor and furniture. The kitchen table had empty cracker boxes and opened plastic wrappers on and under it. There was a disorderliness to it that resembled a more comfortable than typical refugee camp. It was time to move, and he knew it. He removed Megan's keys from his pocket and looked out again. The zombies were crushing themselves against the house with more and more desperation. They bit and clawed and pounded their fists against the walls, doors, and boarded-up window. Neil said aloud to the empty room, "Christ, I hope this works." He pressed his thumb against the remote's panic button, and from down the street came the echoing clarion cry of Megan's car's alarm. He looked down again at the beasts outside. There was a pause for all of them, including Neil, while everyone tried to figure out what the sound was. The walking corpses leaned away from the house at first, not moving but halting their persistent assault on its walls. Starting with those furthest away from the walls, the things started to turn away in the direction of the new sound. Was that the sound of food? With some anxiousness to their steps, as a group they began to shuffle toward the possibility. Neil realized that the remote was also for an auto start installed on the car. Maybe a little more incentive would draw them away quicker. He hit the buttons to start the car and hoped that it had had the desired effect. He didn't know for sure, but it seemed the things in the street picked up their pace, so he thought that maybe it had worked. And it was working. They were leaving the house and giving them an opportunity to escape. He didn't hesitate for even a moment longer. He flew down the stairs, only alighting on perhaps 2 steps per flight, and was in the garage almost immediately. Tony was standing near the garage door and taking in short, shallow breaths like a swimmer getting ready to start a race. "Did it work?" he asked. Neil nodded his head and said, "Yeah, I think so. They cleared out as soon as the alarm went off. I think we're good. For now." Neil hopped into the automobile and turned the ignition. The engine in the minivan came to life, and everyone in the vehicle breathed an audible sigh of relief. Tony smiled at Kim, who was sitting in the back seat, reached down to grab the bottom of the heavy, insulated garage door, and lifted it open. Chapter 59. Kim was still watching as the 3 ghouls still standing on the outside of the garage door leapt into the garage and grabbed hold of Tony. He still had his hands on the garage door handles, now well above his head. He was defenseless as their hands locked onto his reaching arms. Kim screamed. Tony did too when the first one bit him on the soft underside of his right arm. The thing pulled away with a mouthful of dripping red flesh. Not pausing to even chew, it went back for another bite, this time on Tony's shoulder. Tony was trying to fight them off, but they were over him all at once. Rachel, still standing in the minivan, leaned down and grabbed the shotgun between the 2 front seats. She leaned out of the still open side door and fired. The blast knocked her down and out of the minivan and caught Tony's closest attacker across his back and neck. The shot also hit Tony on the right side of his chest, peppering his white shirt with a pattern of red. He and the 3 attackers all fell back against the garage door. Rachel, now lying on the garage floor, stood up and screamed. She didn't wait for even a second and ran, still screaming, into the house. Jerry, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward quickly and slammed the side door shut. Kim shouted, "What the fuck are you doing? I don't want those things in here. Do you? But what about Tony and Rachel?" The 3 ghouls, thankfully, ran past the minivan and its passengers and elected to follow Rachel into the house. Dr. Caldwell looked over at Neil with a question in his eye. There wasn't a whole lot of time, so a decision had to be made. Rachel screamed again from inside. This time, there was pain mixed with terror. From behind him, Neil heard Megan say, "Just go. Get us out of here, Neil." Kim about came unglued. "What? There's nothing that can be done." "But Tony and Rachel, we can't just—" Megan ignored Kim's objection. "Just go, Neil." "You cold goddamn bitch. What kind of a person are you anyway?" "She's right, Neil," Emma said. "Go. They're gone and we're not. So long as we don't sit here—" Neil shifted the vehicle into reverse and hit the gas. They lurched out of the garage, hitting another of the zombies coming up the driveway. Neil looked over at Tony, who was lying motionless on a pile of topsoil bags stacked in the near corner of the garage. Rachel was still screaming from inside the house. Dr. Caldwell looked at Neil again and nodded. Kim continued to protest from the back. She was still looking into the garage after they were out and were reversing deeper into the cul-de-sac. Emma asked, "Where are you going, Neil?" "There's nowhere to go this direction." Neil didn't pause to answer. He just kept reversing until he had pulled the van into a driveway. He then shifted into drive and shot the vehicle forward. He tossed Megan's keys to Dr. Caldwell and said, "Doc, hit the panic button at the right time." "The right time?" "Yeah, I think you'll know when." Kim saw some movement in the garage and screamed with excitement. "It's Tony! He's alive! We gotta pick him up!" When Neil didn't stop, she shouted, "Stop the fucking car! Tony's alive! He needs our help!" But Tony wasn't alive. Not anymore. That fact became readily apparent as his face came into focus for everyone in the car. The rage and fury in his eyes was vacant and pure. He had become one of them, and it had only taken a few moments. Kim was wailing and blubbering in the back seat. She couldn't, and therefore refused to see Tony as anything other than what he once was. In her mind and in her heart, Tony was still the same. He just needed help, and those in the car with her were refusing to help her friend. With tears streaming down her face and her words completely enveloped in emotion, Kim tried to stand up to get into a better position to open the side door and let Tony into the van. Megan finally turned, pushed Kim back down and held her there with both of her hands on her shoulders. She didn't say anything. She just held her there. Jules, who had been sitting on Kim's lap and was now on Emma's very crowded lap, was crying as well. Things went from being fairly tense, like her house used to get before the whole family would leave for vacation, to all of a sudden being outright frightening. She didn't like what was happening, even though she didn't completely understand it either. She didn't know why all those people were so mad, and Tony was just too scary with all that red on him. Why couldn't he just wash all that off so he could get back in the car with the rest of them? Why was he trying to be scary too? She buried her face in Emma's shoulder and chest and cried until the adult's sweatshirt was damp with tears. Danny, for his part, sat as quietly as he was able. When Jules invaded Emma's lap to accommodate Kim's fit, he simply moved aside and made room. Honestly, it was difficult for him to really do anything else. He was a little stunned by what was going on around him. He knew that they were in trouble, and that this could end badly for all of them, though, in truth, he wasn't quite sure what that really meant. In a child's sort of way, he understood death, but had a hard time grasping the finality of it. Death had been a part of movies and video games that could be watched again and again. Death could be negated by a reset or rewind button, and the hero or even the villain was alive again, and any mistakes had been washed away. For the time being, however, Danny sat quietly and tried to contain the sensation that was building in his stomach. It was the anticipation that struck a rider in the lead car of a roller coaster as it crested its first and most steep peak. He could feel the butterflies trying to escape from his mouth. He just swallowed down the fluttering, decorative moths that were threatening to breach. Neil pressed the accelerator to the floor and held the steering wheel tightly between his white, straining knuckles. With those things running at him, he hoped he could get enough speed to punch through. Emma wanted to scream, remembering her previous experience with Officer Ivanov at the helm. She didn't know if this was a better idea now than it was then. She withheld her protests, though not entirely by choice. She was finding it impossible to concentrate enough on one thing to be able to find even the ability for coherent speech. She just tightened her grip on the shiny pistol in her right hand and tried to bury her scream beneath a panicked moan that escaped through tensely sealed lips. The sound resembled a frightened puppy's whimper. It escaped her without ever realizing it until after it had happened. Danny preferred the scream to the moan. It was less unsettling and felt much less like what he'd hear on a roller coaster. Officer Ivanov just sat and stared ahead. He wasn't quite smiling, although the pathetic noises the whore behind him was making were somewhat satisfying, but the emotion evinced in his face wasn't that far off from contentment. His eyes, though, despite what was happening all around them, were empty and distant, like he was lost in deep thought or memory. He wasn't entirely sure what to believe was happening for certain. He couldn't remember for sure, but he thought he'd just been in his father's house, and then all of a sudden he was in Anchorage. He was really having a hard time keeping everything straight at the moment. So, knowing that he could grasp onto that woman's discomfort and know that there were still certainties in this world helped to soothe his fears, but it did not vanquish his disorientation. Jerry, more or less on the floor next to the police officer, kept a watchful eye on him. He was very uncomfortable around Malachi, especially since his comment about Tony. Jerry didn't like the fact that they were in a pretty fragile situation and they had a guy with them who might be a little psychotic, a religious fundamentalist, and most definitely armed. Jerry kept moving his eyes from the windows all around him to Malachi's hand that was closest to his gun. The first several ghouls merely bounced off the minivan, their heads thumping horribly against the bumper and side paneling of the vehicle. The vehicle started to struggle and slow as bodies began to pile up beneath its wheels. Neil tried to swerve in and out of open spaces, but the spaces were too few and too small. They were being enveloped. The van struggled to keep moving forward, like a running back being assailed by an opposing defensive line. When they slowed to but a crawl, Dr. Caldwell looked over and asked through his nearly clenched teeth, "Now?" holding up the key fob. "A few seconds more. We can't do it too early." From their assailants, who were trying desperately to attach themselves to the moving vehicle, the van's windows had become smudged and smeared with brownish finger streaks. Below the windows, which they thankfully couldn't see from inside the van, along the vehicle's sides and bumpers, the mess was much more grisly and stomach-turning. When they had stopped, Neil shouted, "Now!" Dr. Caldwell hit the panic button, and then, above the growling, the grunting, and the screaming, they all heard Megan's alarm begin to howl anew. It demanded and got immediate attention. With the zombies' attention suddenly drawn away from them, there was a lull, of which Neil quickly took advantage by throwing the vehicle into reverse. The van rolled over and pushed aside a few of the things that had tried to close behind them. The vehicle bounced and rocked as it rolled over legs, arms, and torsos, which all cracked and broke beneath its tires. Emma was hugging the children on her lap, close against her chest with her free left arm. Jules burrowed her face deeper into Emma's chest and tried to find a song in her head to chase away her fear. She didn't like this one bit, and the fact that her mother wasn't there to hold her and tell her that everything was going to be all right made things that much worse. Due in large part to the distraction of Megan's alarm, Neil got them free again from the confused mix of stumbling and knotted former humanity. Once clear, he shifted the vehicle back into drive and made a hard and fast detour around the struggling ghouls now conveniently gathered and clumped in the middle of the street. He steered the van through a flat yard and across a couple of driveways and simply drove around the group. Once around, he got them back on the pavement and drove out and away. A few of the fresher-looking corpses tried to pursue, but the van's speed on the clear street made the pursuit on foot all for naught, though not for lack of trying. Neil watched them continue to chase after them as he got them onto the old Seward highway, and they dropped out of sight. He knew that they were still following, but that wouldn't matter so long as they could keep moving. There were stalled and abandoned cars dotting the road, but there were enough gaps here and there that they were able to make their way out onto Huffman Road. The little retail park to their left, once bustling with activity, was bereft of even the most remote signs of life. Even the ravens, the garbage-scavenging dumpster divers of the north, had abandoned the litter-filled parking lots. Discarded newspapers, empty plastic shopping bags, and any other lightweight scraps of a world in decay fluttered on the stiff autumn breezes. There were other piles of garbage scattered here and there, but then Neil realized after looking at one that was nearer to the road that the piles of garbage were actually decomposing bodies. He couldn't figure out how there could be dead bodies, considering what happened to a body that met its demise at the hands, or, more to the point, teeth of one of those things. Whether he could understand it or not, there they lay. Just drive, he thought to himself. Just drive. None of it much mattered anymore. He just needed to drive and put all of it behind them, as if that was even possible. He drove them straight ahead into the mouth of the great unknown. Just when he thought there was no comfort left in the world, Megan's hands, no longer restraining Kim, found their way to Neil's shoulders. She touched him lightly, massaging his tensed neck and soothing his doubts and fears. Even if only for the briefest of moments, she leaned forward and whispered, "Thank you." Epilogue. Escape, desperate and imperfect, led to as many new questions as old answers. The reeking siege had been broken, but spreading out before them was all the doubt and peril a city of the undead could muster. As they waded further into the fetid depths of the infection's grip, the sense that they may have traded the punishing frying pan for the voracious fire struck all of them. There was much more to escaping than simply getting away, and that fact was becoming more apparent with each nervous breath. Was being on the run any better than hiding and waiting? Only time would tell. But how much time did any of them have? The one certainty for all of them was that this was not the end. Nor was this the end of the infection. This was simply the conclusion of the first stage of the epidemic, Act 1. Can the infection be contained? Perhaps the second act, containment, holds the answers. Perhaps.
This has been an Audible Frontiers production. Executive producer, Steve Feldberg. Producer, Mike Charzik. Copyright 2011-2012 by Sean Schubert. Audio recording copyright 2012 by Audible, Inc.